Today, I'm making a list about a category that is near and dear to my heart, as it contains many of my favorite basketball memories throughout the years. We're looking at the top 5 greatest dunk contests in NBA history. Now I should clarify, this is not just about the greatest individual dunks, but it's about the greatest collection of dunks that also contain plenty of hype, plenty of excitement, some star power, and some originality. If one of those categories isn't present, it doesn't necessarily disqualify it from the list, but each of those aspects can contribute to ranking it higher on my list. So let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with my choices and how your list would differ from mine. Starting off with number 5 is the NBA dunk contest in 2015. This one had plenty of excitement and athleticism. Some of the dunks involved weren't the most impressive, but you did have Victor Oladipo making this amazing 540 slam. And the part that really secured it on this list was the emergence of a young Zach LaVine. He was only 19 years old at this point, and he became the second youngest dunk contest winner ever behind an 18-year-old Kobe Bryant. His most impressive dunk was probably his opener, as he made this incredible reverse East Bay dunk while rocking the Space Jam jersey. By the end of this dunk contest, the young LaVine had basically made the East Bay his signature move. And with this, a star was born, as he was suddenly recognized as the best dunker in the entire league. Number 4, the 2003 dunk contest. This one was especially exciting because it had a collection of some raw power dunkers. But the main event was between two of the best dunkers of the early 2000s, as they had athleticism, style, and power. It was Desmond Mason and Jason Richardson. They were getting the crowd insanely excited as they traded one impressive dunk for another. For a little while, it looked like Mason was going to take home the award after he completed this impressive East Bay dunk with tremendous distance. But Jason Richardson was the guy who had the last attempt, and what he did was a lob to himself East Bay left-handed reverse slam, and it sent the crowd and the other players into an absolute frenzy, as we witnessed a variation of a dunk that we had never seen before. Without question, Jason Richardson is one of the most underrated dunkers in basketball history, and this was his iconic moment. Number 3, the 2000 dunk contest. This one is in this spot for a very obvious reason: the absolute peak of Vince Carter's dunking abilities. If this list was about the most iconic dunk contest, then this one would certainly be in the top spot. Carter was incredible as he opened it up with his spinning windmill slam, and I'm sure all of us can recite the call word for word. He also had another incredible windmill slam where he came from out of bounds. And of course, he had his between the legs point to the sky dunk that he got off of the pass from his fellow competitor and teammate Tracy McGrady. He capped it off with a seemingly underwhelming but yet surprising elbow slam that has since been duplicated many times afterwards. There were some other tremendous athletes like Steve Francis and Tracy McGrady chipping in some impressive dunks of their own, but obviously Vince Carter stole the show, and is the reason why 2000 finishes so high on this list. Number 2, the 1988 dunk contest. This one was an amazing show in Chicago, as it not only had impressive dunks, but it also had star power and an exciting rivalry. Dominique Wilkins and Michael Jordan were two of the best dunkers that the league had to offer, and this was not their first time competing against one another. They were going back and forth mesmerizing the crowd, doing one impressive dunk after another, and for a while it looked like either guy could be taking home the trophy. But after a few points were left on the board, it was Michael Jordan who was going to have the last laugh, as he sealed the dunk contest with this iconic free throw dunk, which has now been immortalized in basketball lore. Not only were we watching these two stars compete in the dunk contest, but we were used to watching these superstar players go toe-to-toe in basketball games, dropping 40 and 50 points, which honestly enhanced the experience of witnessing them compete in a dunk contest. It just amplified their rivalry and added another chapter to their story. For this reason, this one gets some extra points on this highly competitive list. Number 1, the 2016 NBA dunk contest. As the years go on, I realize more and more that there really is no question which one should be taking the top spot. This was the famous battle between Zach LaVine and Aaron Gordon, and many people believe to this day that Aaron Gordon should have won the contest. He had two incredibly iconic dunks involving a mascot, and the one that especially stole the show was when he basically sat down in midair, put the ball underneath his legs, and slammed it down behind his head. To this day, this is one of the most jaw-dropping displays of athleticism that I've ever seen. LaVine had some incredible dunks of his own, and it's crazy that Aaron Gordon was so good that Zach LaVine's windmill from the free throw line dunk is essentially an afterthought of this amazing competition. The only minor complaint I have about this contest is that it didn't involve two superstar players like there were competing in the 1988 dunk contest between Jordan and Dominique. With that being said, it was basically perfect in every other aspect, and I think most people will agree that this was the greatest dunk contest of all time. Here is my list of honorable mentions. Should any of these other dunk contests have made the top 5 instead? Today's video is just a fun one, and let me first clarify, there is no objective way to make this list. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, especially when you're looking at slam dunks. So although I'm titling this video the top 20 greatest dunks in NBA history, it's really just my top 20 favorite based on how impressive they look to me. What I want to know is, how would your list differ from mine? There is a lot to choose from, and the honorable mentions list is going to be very, very long. I will say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, this was the most difficult list I've ever had to make. And from the time I've spent looking around the internet, nobody's list is ever accepted or praised. They're always told how much of an idiot they are for how they ranked it. So understand, these are just my choices, and I want to hear yours. I'm looking at a variety of things: style, power, finesse, the context in which it happened, and even star power kind of helps if I'm being honest. So with all that being said, let's stop wasting time and get into the list. Number 20, Kobe Bryant on Dwight Howard. This one is absolutely iconic. The Mamba still had every bit of his athleticism, and he split the defenders and finished strongly over a rookie Dwight Howard, who never forgot that play for the rest of his career. Not only was there style and was there power in this play, but it was between two superstar players who would go on to be teammates and have quite the colorful history. So this one gets some extra points for a variety of reasons. Number 19, Shaquille O'Neal violating Dudley. This one was amazing. Shaq not only dunks the ball and finishes strongly, but he does his iconic image spreading his legs, violating Dudley, and then lands and shoves him to the ground. Even if this is just the 19th spot on my list for the greatest dunk of all time, it is certainly number 1 for being the most disrespectful dunk that I've ever seen. Number 18, Tom Chambers' dunk on Mark Jackson. From my time surfing the internet and seeing this highlight, this one seems to be quite divisive. It's a pretty basic dunk, and there isn't a tremendous amount of style, and yes, Tom Chambers is 6'10". But when you look at this dunk in slow motion, he seems to elevate even more after he hits Mark Jackson with his knee. And by the time he's actually flushing it down, he is way above the rim as he's completing the two-handed slam. Tom Chambers is already an underrated and underappreciated player, and this one especially right here is an all-timer that deserves to be recognized. Number 17, Baron Davis on AK-47. This was during the Warriors' famous We Believe season, and to me, this is the iconic capsulated moment that really symbolizes what that season meant to Warriors fans. The energy in the crowd was electric as he cocked it back and slammed it over the top of one of the best defenders in the entire league, who was much bigger than him. Baron Davis was an athletic freak, and this one that he gave us had us all shook back in the mid-2000s. Number 16, Blake Griffin on Timothy Mozgov. You guys all know this one. Blake Griffin was one of the most athletic players of his era, and he elevated way above Mozgov to complete this dunk. Not only did he just thunderously throw it in from several feet away, but it was how he grabbed Mozgov's head as he was doing it. Talk about embarrassing. Number 15. Derrick Rose's two-handed slam on Goran Dragic. This was during the peak excitement of an athletic Derrick Rose, as he was fast and explosive, and to me, no single play better encapsulates that than this dunk. I love the way he thunderously flushed it down with two hands, and it seemed like his descension took forever just based on how high he got above the rim. Number 14. Ja Morant on January 14th, 2023. Ja is ridiculously athletic, and he has plenty of these types of dunks. But as far as his dunks go, this one is my favorite. The way he cuts to the basket, the way he takes the ball back so ridiculously far, more than you think he was capable of, and then finished it emphatically. I don't know if there's any player in NBA history who takes the ball back further before slamming it down than Ja Morant does. Give us some time and let this one age in our memory, and who knows, it might even climb up the list. Number 13. LeBron James on Jusuf Nurkic. This was probably the angriest dunk from LeBron that I've ever seen, as he cut to the basket and absolutely posterized Jusuf Nurkic. This one was special for a couple reasons. For one, LeBron was starting to get up there in his age at this point. So although you could see him doing this in his early Cleveland days or in his Miami days, a lot of people didn't think he had this kind of dunk still left in the tank. Beyond that, it wasn't just how hard LeBron dunked it, but it was where he jumped from. It had the distance, it had the elevation, and it had the attitude, all coming together to make one of the greatest dunks of all time. Number 12. Scottie Pippen on Patrick Ewing. This was during the time that Michael Jordan was retired, and in that 1994 season, the Chicago Bulls and the New York Knicks rivalry was at its all-time peak. Scottie Pippen converted this dunk over one of the best rim protectors in the entire league, Patrick Ewing. And not only did he embarrass him, but then he shoved him and walked over him, just adding to the intensity and the playoff atmosphere. Then after that play is done, he goes and he walks by Spike Lee, who's basically the New York Knicks mascot, and talks some trash to him as well. This was probably the most badass and iconic moment of Scottie Pippen's career. Number 11. Dwayne Wade on Kendrick Perkins. Every once in a while, you see a dunk that has tremendous beauty and tremendous power, and this was one of them. Dwayne Wade was so quick, and then he made a tremendous spin move and made a two-handed slam that absolutely destroyed Kendrick Perkins. And he finished off the highlight with a goofy yet memorable dance move. Number 10. Julius Erving rocking the cradle on Michael Cooper. This was an iconic moment in the NBA Finals, and Erving stole the ball and finished the dunk over the top of one of the greatest defensive players in the history of the game. Not only was Julius so good at gliding through the air, but the way he tucked the basketball and finished over the top was something that anybody who was watching at that time will never forget. Number 9. Anthony Edwards on John Collins. It's hard to rank this one early on, but without question, it was the greatest dunk in this most recent season, as Edwards thunderously and powerfully completed this dunk that sent shockwaves all over social media. He ended up screwing up his finger on the play, but given the fact that he won the Dunk of the Year award for that dunk, and given the fact that people will be seeing that replay over and over again for as long as we live, I think it was worth it. Number 8. Gerald Green's windmill lob. This one was awesome. I understand it isn't a poster, and I understand that there was really no interference between him and the rim. But still, as lob passes go, this is one of the all-time greats. It isn't just that he took a lob and he made it a windmill, but there's that iconic instant replay where you can see his head well above the rim. This guy was an athletic freak who had some of the greatest hops that I've ever seen, and when you finish it with this windmill that he had, it certainly deserves a spot in my top 10. Number 7. LeBron James on Jason Terry. This one is iconic for several reasons. For one, this was a revenge statement for LeBron James, who was dunking on Jason Terry, who had once embarrassed him in the 2011 NBA Finals. Now LeBron had just angrily posterized him and even stood over and stared at him to really drive the point home. For me, this is the greatest and biggest statement dunk of LeBron James's career. Number 6. Vince Carter on Alonzo Mourning. You know what's funny, because Vince Carter's peak as a dunker was certainly in his time in Toronto, but if you ask me, his best in-game NBA dunk was when he destroyed Alonzo Mourning, who just happens to be one of the greatest rim protectors of all time. Yes, the dunk was nice, but the lead up to the dunk is really what completes it, as Carter was a tremendous ball handler, and he put the ball behind his back before driving to the lane and absolutely embarrassing Mourning. Number 5. Kobe's reverse dunk on Minnesota. You guys know this one. It was when Kevin Harlan iconically made the call saying that Kobe just sucked the gravity out of the target center. For most people, this one usually isn't ranked this high, but for me, it's just how difficult and stylish it was. Usually you don't see reverse dunks with this kind of power, and when you look at the baseline view, just look at where Kobe took off from and where he ended up completing the dunk. Look at the way he had to contort his body just to make this happen. And on top of this, Kobe was also dealing with a significant shoulder injury at this time. So not only was the dunk just impressive, but it was completely unexpected at this point. Number 4. Michael Jordan jamming it on Patrick Ewing. This was just as Michael was starting to make his ascension and started winning NBA championships. And this play featured many of the things that made Michael so great. His tremendous ball handling, his shiftiness, and he already burned 2 other guys on his way to Patrick Ewing. Making that move on the baseline is absolutely impressive. But to then complete the dunk over Patrick Ewing, elevating that much higher than the 7-foot center, is utterly remarkable. And I still remember to this day how much the commentators were losing his mind after he made that dunk. I think we've got a bit used to this one in the years since, simply because we've seen this dunk from Jordan so many times. But when you look at it for all that it is, and for how difficult it was to complete, it certainly deserves a top 5 spot in my mind. Number 3. Shawn Kemp on Alton Lister. Remember how I said Shaq had the most disrespectful dunk in NBA history? Well, this one certainly joins it in the top 3. Kemp was one of the most thunderous and mean finishers at the rim. He was always dunking the ball as if the rim owed him money, and this one was no different. There was plenty of lead up to the dunk, as he ran up, tucked the ball in his arm, and then finished it thunderously on Alton Lister as that Seattle crowd was buzzing like they normally were. Then he had the audacity to double point the finger at Lister while he was sitting on his butt after he had just been embarrassed. This one wasn't just impressive and disrespectful, but it is iconic. Number 2. Blake Griffin on Kendrick Perkins. Speaking of power dunkers, it doesn't get much better than Blake Griffin, as he was absolutely destroying the rim early in his career. This one was during their Lob City days off of a great pass from Chris Paul, and what ensued was one of the most powerful dunks that I've ever seen. It's almost like he elevated, made body contact with Perkins, and then elevated even further before finally flushing it down. The energy in that building was insane, and thanks to Blake Griffin and the rest of Lob City, there was genuinely some moments where I was more excited to watch Clippers basketball than Lakers basketball. And I say that as a Lakers fan. Number 1. DeAndre Jordan off of the CP3 lob. I've seen this one get the number 1 spot on many other lists, and I'm telling you, when it went down and when it first happened, it was a viral internet moment. Everyone was talking about it. I get it, DeAndre Jordan isn't necessarily a star player, and he is a big guy dunking on a little guy. But as far as posters go, this is the absolute pinnacle of what they're meant to be, as it was ferocious, thunderous, disrespectful, and he had left his defender on the floor as if he had just been jumped. Everybody was reacting to it on the court, in the crowd, and on the internet. For me, this is the cream of the crop. This is the poster dunk that everyone is aiming for when they're attacking the rim. And personally, I think it's just funny that the Clippers have the top 2 spots. Here is my long list of honorable mentions. And trust me, I even know that there's many other great dunks that should have been on this list but are not. There's just too many to tackle in simply one video. But let me know, which dunks were not in my top 20 but should have been? Also, how would you move the dunks higher or lower on my list? I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comment section below. Let me start off this video by making my heart and feelings clear. I freaking love my job, and I love this group of subscribers that I've got. If you're a YouTuber and you're not grateful for your following, something must be wrong about the way you were raised. When I take my wife to dinner, we say a prayer and thank the Lord for what we've been given, and sometimes I literally audibly say, "Thank you subs" as well. And we usually chuckle, but the gesture is genuine. I never want to lose that attitude of gratitude when it comes to how much you guys have blessed my life. So anyway, enough already about that warm and fuzzy sappy crap. Sometimes, not specifically my audience, but the basketball community in general, make certain narratives and critiques that honestly blow my mind with how ridiculous they are. And it gets to a point where you hear them regurgitated enough that it literally gets to the point of annoyance. I know I'm not speaking a foreign language here. You guys are basketball fans with your own strong opinions. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Today, I'm explaining the 3 things that annoy me the most about basketball fandom as a whole, and let me know in the comments what are some things that annoy you as well. First off, the criticism of quote bad defense in specific eras. This goes both ways. Older basketball fans criticize the general defense of the modern era, and younger basketball fans criticize the defense of past eras. Neither perspective particularly annoys me on the surface level. But for me, it's their approach that drives me insane. If you go on social media, whether it be Twitter, Instagram, or whatever, you'll see a highlight from past basketball eras, and in the comments will be annoying modern fans, talking about how defense was horrible back then. At the same time, you'll see current NBA highlights, and in the comments will be a bunch of triggered old guys talking about how bad defense is today. The annoying part is how people draw these massive conclusions based on anecdotal evidence. Anyone can draw some massive conclusion off of one specific play, but that play doesn't do an accurate job of portraying the lay of the land as a whole. Even the greatest defensive players in NBA history have had instances where they were lazy on defense, or didn't make the right rotations when they needed to. Now, if there's a massive 15-minute long compilation video of a specific player being lazy on defense, well then okay. Well, now we can solidify a narrative. But let's not be the kind of fan who saw one player poorly defending Michael Jordan, or one guy poorly defending LeBron James, so now we have to condemn an entire era for it. The more interesting conversation are the way defenses have changed throughout the eras, and the way the rules allow certain advantages while eliminating others. Stuff like the switch from the man defenses to zone defenses, the elimination of hand checking, the changes in refereeing, and the way the game is more spaced out due to better perimeter shooting. All of these are more worthy of an in-depth discussion than a couple of dudes getting lazy on defense, which has literally been happening since the day the game was invented. The second thing that significantly annoys me is when people tell me that I'm too biased towards older players. If any of you viewers consider yourself a basketball historian, get ready to hear a lot of this one. This is obviously coming fresh after my 30 greatest players video, and in the video, I gave my very subjective list of the best players of all time. As always, these types of lists tend to trigger people, and one of the more common criticisms was that my list was too biased toward older players. I'm not gonna lie, this was one of the dumbest casual takes I've heard. This is how these Neanderthals think. The last 15 years in NBA history are what they consider as new players, and the first 61 years of NBA history are all lumped together and are considered as old players. And if you're picking and ranking players higher from here than you are from here, then you're too biased towards older players. Not only are the quote older players a much larger pool, but all of these guys also have completed resumes, while the younger players do not. Now listen, angry 15-year-old in the chat. Unlike you, the NBA was not born yesterday. In the rich history of this game, there are many incredibly talented and deserving individuals. You're talking about more than 6 decades worth of amazing basketball that you simply write off as older players. The issue isn't that we're too biased towards older generations. The issue is that you have a very limited knowledge of basketball history. But you know, it's a free country, so go ahead and keep calling everything that's happened in the last 10 years the greatest thing of all time, even though your conscious reality of time is roughly 10 years. You are definitely the arbiter of what's the greatest thing of all time. Now you guys didn't think I was just gonna go after some of the younger fans, right? Nope. For my third topic of annoyance, I'm looking at a few of the older fellas in the community who always love to claim that modern players wouldn't have survived in previous eras. I hate to break it to you, but this everything was better back in my day rhetoric is something that's basically always been a thing in the NBA. This is an interview from Conan O'Brien's show in 1997. And in the interview, Wilt Chamberlain claims that the unstoppable force that is Shaquille O'Neal would struggle against centers from the 1960s. In the same interview, listen what he goes on to say about Michael Jordan playing in his era.
Well, his playing style is he's 6'7" and he's like 197 pounds. Coming into what we call our domain, the pivot for us big guys, would not have been very wise of Michael, you know, if he was playing during our time. So we would say, Michael, you know, as long as you do all those fancy things outside of where we are, that's fine. So it wouldn't have been good for Michael.
Really?
No.
You think he'd have been crushed, is what you're saying?
I don't think. I know he'd been crushed. Right, yeah.
So you're saying Michael Jordan back then would have been on the bench the whole time?
Absolutely. You know, being considered how to think about that, and that's the truth.
This isn't just a Wilt Chamberlain thing either, but guys like Julius Erving and many others have made claims like this as well. At one point, this was a common narrative coming from the older generation, that the 90s was the era of soft basketball. 30 years after Wilt played, people were belittling the competition of Michael Jordan. And now, 30 years after Michael Jordan played, people are belittling the competition of the modern game. Now sure, in different eras, there are different rules. In the 80s, you could straight up clobber someone and not get severely punished for it, since the flagrant foul basically wasn't implemented until the year 1990. With that being said, a guy who's 6'9", 260 pounds is allowed to dish out physical punishment as well. Sure, the bad boy Detroit Pistons would have tried to clobber a guy like LeBron James, but that's easier said than done. Defensive play styles like that would certainly be an adjustment for modern players. But when you say a guy like LeBron or Steph Curry wouldn't survive in the 80s or 90s, do you mean that literally? If not, do you mean that they would just retire? Of course they wouldn't. That's ridiculous. They would adapt and they would thrive. I believe the physicality of previous generations has less to do with the mental toughness of the players and is more about what the league permitted back then compared to the more strict modern NBA. Acting like these grown men would go home crying to their mama is a little overly dramatic to say the least. So what do you guys think? What is the most annoying thing to you about the basketball community? Let me know in the comment section below. Thanks. Let me first clarify, you saw what the video title is, but what may be an even more descriptive title would be NBA series that determine the pecking order. What I essentially mean is specific playoff series in NBA history that went a certain way. But if it had gone differently, then it would have completely switched the all-time rankings of the two superstars involved. To me, this video is a very simple concept, but it's also a fascinating topic, because it really shows you the significance of each playoff series and of each individual game, and sometimes of even one shot. In one evening, a player's legacy can be completely altered for decades to come, simply based on how he performs against the other star on that specific night. Hopefully this all makes sense, but if not, you'll get it by the end of the first segment. So without further ado, let's get into it. First off, Larry Bird and Magic Johnson in the 1987 NBA Finals. This was the third time that these two rivals met up in the finals during the 1980s, and it was massive in terms of bragging rights. because the winner of that series was taking a 2-championships-to-1 lead in those 80s matchups. Well, as you all know, Magic Johnson and the Lakers went on to defeat the Celtics in 6 games. Magic put up monstrous averages, was the finals MVP, and even had the iconic game-winning hook shot in Game 4. But even more significant than that was the fact that Magic secured his 5th championship ring compared to Bird's 3. And one of the lasting images from that battle was when Larry was in a press conference after suffering defeat and admitted that he believed Magic Johnson was simply the better player.
Magic's just a great basketball player. He's the best I've ever seen, Unbelievable. I don't know what to say.
Now, over 3 decades later, Magic Johnson is usually recognized as the player who's higher on the all-time list. But I honestly believe that all changes if the Celtics had won the series. Think about it. Larry Bird was leading Magic in MVP awards at that point 3-2, and Bird had just won 3 out of the last 4 MVP awards. Many people were already thinking that Larry was the better individual player. If the Celtics had won, Magic would have just 4 championships to Larry Bird's 4, and Bird would then also have the edge in Finals MVPs 3-2. Beyond that, Bird would have the last laugh, defeating Magic 2 out of the 3 times that they met on the game's biggest stage. Not only was this one series so massive, but you could even argue that the legacies were defined on the last shot of Game 4. If Bird buries that game winner, then the Celtics would have had a commanding 3-2 lead by the end of Game 5. But alas, he missed the shot, and the Lakers went on to close out the series soon afterwards. This whole thing really gives you some perspective on just how closely competitive their rivalry truly was. Next up, LeBron James and Steph Curry in the 2016 NBA Finals. You all know this series. It was the second straight time that these two teams met up in the NBA Finals, and they would go on to battle on the game's biggest stage in 4 seasons straight. The Warriors were looking to complete a historic season where they had finished the regular season with a 73-9 record, which was the greatest in NBA history. Steph Curry had also broke the record for the most three-pointers made in a single season. He just had the highest scoring 50-40-90 season ever, and he was named the back-to-back MVP winner, as he became the first and only unanimous MVP in NBA history. I remember the narrative during that regular season, and people were saying that Steph Curry had now replaced LeBron James as the face of the league. But as you all know, LeBron emphatically shut down that narrative as he led his Cavs to make a 3-1 comeback, winning the series in 7 games, while giving Cleveland their first championship in franchise history. Here's the thing, everything changes if Cleveland had lost that series. Even LeBron James recognizes how critical the 2016 championship is to his GOAT case. If LeBron had lost that series, then he only has 3 championships. 2 of them came on a super team, and the other was the Orlando bubble in 2020. He would have a record of 3-7 in the NBA Finals, and he would have been eliminated by Steph Curry's Warriors a whopping 4 seasons straight. In this scenario, he would have never defeated Steph in the NBA Finals. On the other hand, Steph would have 5 championship rings instead of 4, and it would have completed the 73-9 season with a championship, which probably would have solidified them as the consensus greatest team ever. Steph also would have won 4 straight championships, which Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant never did. If Kyrie Irving doesn't hit that 3, and if LeBron doesn't get that blocked shot, then I believe we would be having debates today about whether Steph Curry or Michael Jordan is the greatest player of all time, rather than LeBron James and MJ. Next on the list is Akeem Olajuwon and David Robinson in the 1995 Western Conference Finals. Nowadays, basically everyone has Olajuwon higher on their all-time list than Robinson, but during their peaks, there was a legitimate debate on who the better center was. When the 2 centers squared off in 1995, David Robinson had just won the league MVP. And Olajuwon has been quite frank in the years since about how that was a motivating factor for him. He absolutely decimated the Admiral in that series, nearly dropping 40 points in 4 out of the 6 games. Obviously, after Houston closed out the Spurs in 6, they went on to win the championship over the Orlando Magic in the finals. Now, there's no guarantee that the Spurs would have gone on to beat a talented Orlando Magic team, but if they had, the legacy comparison would have been overwhelmingly in favor of Robinson, as he would have a total of 3 championship rings to Hakeem's 1. And like all the other comparisons, the lasting impression of Robinson winning the Battle of the Bigs would have been monumental in how we remember the two. Even if the Spurs went on to lose to the Magic in the finals, Robinson would still have 2 rings to Olajuwon's 1. And with his victory in their playoff battle, that would likely push his case over the hump. On the other hand, Olajuwon already has to deal with this narrative. But if he had only won 1 championship in 1994, which just happened to be the full season that Jordan was retired, then the narrative would only be stronger that he was only able to eat well because MJ wasn't around. Last on the list is Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson in the 1991 NBA Finals. This was a highly anticipated and extremely hyped matchup between the guy seen as the face of the league and the guy seen as the future face of the league. When it comes down to it, Jordan and the Bulls simply had the better roster, as they closed out the series in just 5 games. Not only do I believe that this series would have shifted their rankings if it had gone differently, but I believe it would have them completely switch places as to who's widely recognized as the greatest player of all time. You need to understand, the Lakers didn't win this series and they should not have won this series. Magic no longer had the assistance of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who had retired somewhat recently. On top of that, Magic's Lakers were shorthanded, as his 2 best scoring weapons, James Worthy and Byron Scott, both missed significant time in the finals due to injuries. Even against all odds, if Magic somehow won the title instead of Jordan, it would give Magic 6 rings to Jordan's 5, and it would be the lasting image of Magic's career that he bested Jordan in his final season, in a series that he wasn't supposed to win. For MJ, it would have been a whole new damning narrative, that he was never able to win until Magic allowed him to by retiring. People would be saying that Magic was the face of the 80s, and he could have been the face of the 90s if he didn't get HIV. From that perspective, in that reality, I don't see how anyone could have comfortably referred to Michael Jordan as the greatest player of all time when Magic Johnson had that as his legacy. I love the game of basketball, and I genuinely love discussing and comparing greats of the game to one another. But what I can't stand is when people do it in bad faith. Your favorite player and the player you think is the GOAT can be Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, or LeBron James. Regardless of who your guy is, I can respect your stance. The only part that irritates me is when people are disingenuous with their arguments. How this usually manifests itself is that people will make absurd criticisms against the player who is in direct competition with their favorite player. Due to these biases, people will perpetuate specific critiques and narratives that honestly shouldn't carry any weight. Today, I'm breaking down 3 critiques that I can't stand from 3 of the greatest players of all time. First off, LeBron James and his 4-6 in the finals criticism. The fact that people try and turn this incredibly impressive achievement into a form of criticism is mind-boggling to me. LeBron James has 4 NBA championship rings and made it all the way to the NBA Finals on 10 different occasions, and with a total of 3 different franchises. As amazing as that sounds, it's the 4 and 6 part that gets regurgitated over and over again. The criticism implies that if LeBron only made it to the NBA Finals 4 times in his career and won all 4 times, that would be more impressive than his total of 10 appearances with 4 championships. Essentially, they're critiquing LeBron for making it too deep into the playoffs on 6 occasions, which is obviously ridiculous when you look at it objectively. The best example of why that critique is absurd is because of the 2007 postseason. At that point in LeBron's young career, he was only 22 years old, and he was leading the Cavaliers in the Eastern Conference Finals against the first-seeded Detroit Pistons. The Pistons were a team with championship experience and several All-Stars on their roster. This was the Pistons' 5th straight season where they had made it to the Eastern Conference Finals, and they were the heavy favorites heading into this series. What Detroit wasn't ready for was a young LeBron James who would perform in a way that was reminiscent of a prime Michael Jordan. In Game 5 especially, LeBron went absolutely nuts as he dropped 48 points, 9 rebounds, and 7 assists on 54.5% shooting, leading his Cavs in overtime to a 2-point victory. To say that James carried his team to victory would be a massive understatement, as LeBron scored the final 25 points for the Cleveland Cavaliers. In my opinion, this is one of the top 3 greatest playoff performances in NBA history, and it was done by a kid who wasn't even old enough to rent a car in most cases. The Cavaliers absolutely had no business beating the far more experienced Detroit Pistons that series, but thanks to LeBron's legendary performance, the Cavs were able to achieve the unthinkable. Now imagine using this performance as a criticism against LeBron's legacy. Sounds crazy, but that's exactly what people are doing when they mention the 4-6 narrative. Because LeBron's Cavs went on to lose in the NBA Finals against the dynastic San Antonio Spurs. By the logic of the 4-6 critique, it would have been better for his legacy if LeBron never dropped those 48 points, he never scored the Cavs' final 25, and instead just laid over while the Pistons routed them out of the playoffs. Of course, that's stupid. So even if you're a Jordan guy, don't make this disingenuous critique and punish a player for something that should be appreciated. Speaking of which, next we're looking at Michael Jordan and the critique that he kept losing in the first round before Pippen showed up. Anytime anyone makes this criticism, I assume they did it either because they're so biased against Jordan that they ignore the truth, or because they're so young, so they're obviously gonna be naive about the details of that era. Scottie Pippen wasn't drafted until the 87-88 season, which means that Jordan's first round critique is based on his first 3 seasons in the NBA. So let's take a look at those. MJ had one of the greatest rookie seasons of all time, as his regular season numbers appeared extremely similar to Kobe Bryant's lone MVP season. You could even argue that Jordan's numbers were better. A rookie Jordan improved the Bulls' 11 wins over the previous season, and despite having no other All-Stars in the roster, he was able to carry them to the 7th seed in the Eastern Conference. The team they were going up against in the first round was an extremely stacked Milwaukee Bucks squad, who had multiple All-Stars and who had won 59 games throughout the regular season. Along with their high-powered offense, the Bucks had the second best defense in the entire league. The leader of that defense was one of the greatest wing defenders of NBA history, Sidney Moncrief, who was in the prime of his career and is still the only guard in NBA history to win the Defensive Player of the Year award multiple times. Yes, a rookie Michael Jordan lost that series, but his clearly inferior squad was never expected to win in the first place, and despite being guarded by one of the greatest wing defenders of all time, he still had a pretty monstrous series on an individual level. Blaming Jordan for losing in the first round of 1985 would be ridiculous. Then we gotta look at the next 2 seasons, 1986 and 1987. Once again, Jordan had monstrous seasons individually, but he was still the only All-Star player on the Chicago Bulls. After breaking his foot early in the 1986 season, he went against the doctor's wishes and returned to action early and proceeded to drag his Bulls into the 8th-seeded spot of the playoffs. Waiting for them in the first round was a team that some people still think is the greatest team in NBA history, the 1986 Boston Celtics. Most basketball historians agree that at the very least, these Celtics were a top 5 team of all time. They won 67 games throughout the regular season and had the best defense in the entire league. At that point, Jordan was the only Hall of Famer on the Bulls squad. The 1986 Celtics had 5. Despite going up against one of the greatest teams and defenses of all time, Jordan averaged nearly 44 points, 6 rebounds, 6 assists, over 2 steals, and more than 1 block on over 50% shooting from the field. Included in that stat line was the greatest scoring performance in playoff history, when Jordan dropped 63 in Boston Garden. The highest scoring playoff performance of all time was against a #1 ranked defense. Once again, blaming this first round loss on Jordan would be incredibly stupid. The next season, despite his weak supporting cast, Jordan improved the Bulls by 10 wins, but that still only landed them the 8th seed in the Eastern Conference. So waiting for them once again in the first round was the exact same super team Boston Celtics. Yet again, Jordan did his part, exploding statistically over the course of the series. But the Celtics' 5 Hall of Famers were clearly too much. These are the 3 first-round exits before Pippen showed up, to a dominant 59-win Milwaukee Bucks team in his rookie season, and to one of the top 5 super teams of all time in 1986 and 1987. Back in the day, you would have been considered a fool to think that Jordan was going to beat any of those teams by himself. Yet some people today act like he should have done just that. The following season was Scotty's rookie year, but Pippen was a very slow bloomer and took time to develop his game both offensively and defensively. In the regular season of his rookie year, Pippen only averaged 8 points, 4 rebounds, and 2 assists in 20 minutes per game. Of course, this was the year the Bulls finally got past the first round. And according to the Jordan naysayers, it's not because Jordan averaged 45 points, 5 rebounds, 5 assists, 3 steals, and 1.5 blocks on 56% shooting over the course of the series. Certainly not. It was because Pippen arrived just in time to save the day off the bench, as he averaged 10 points in 27 minutes per game. Again, don't perpetuate this Jordan first-round narrative. It makes you look like a filthy casual to those who actually know NBA history. Last on the list is Kobe Bryant and the critique that he blew a 3-1 lead in 2006 against the Suns. Kobe's 05-06 season is famous among basketball enthusiasts, and for good reason. It's the season where he scored 62 points in 3 quarters against that year's Western Conference champions, the Dallas Mavericks, and is where he scored 81 points against the Toronto Raptors, which is still the second highest scoring performance of all time. In that regular season, Kobe averaged 35.4 points per game and was named first team all-defense. That is still the highest scoring season ever for a player who also made first team all-defense. In order to make the playoffs, this Herculean effort was required of Kobe, as his roster was devoid of talent outside of Lamar Odom. Guys like Kwame Brown, Luke Walton, Chris Mihm, and Smush Parker were consistently in the starting rotation. On most Western Conference teams, those same players would have struggled to get a roster spot. Regardless, Kobe led his Lakers to 45 wins throughout the regular season, which was good enough for the 7th seed in the Western Conference. Waiting for them in the first round of the playoffs was the far more talented and deeper Phoenix Suns. Heading into the series, the Lakers were considered as significant underdogs. Regardless, the first 4 games in the series ended up being extremely close, where each contest could have gone either way. In Game 4 especially, Kobe provided late-game heroics, and with his iconic game-winning buzzer beater, the Lakers took an improbable 3-1 lead in the series. Now, did the Lakers go on to lose the series? Absolutely. But unlike, say, the Golden State Warriors in 2016, the Lakers weren't these massive favorites heading into the series, and were basically playing with house money. Before the series, no one thought the Lakers would ever get up 3-1 in the first place. So when the Lakers went on to lose the next 3 games against Phoenix, not many of us were actually surprised by that, because we knew how lucky the Lakers were to get up 3-1. The other reason why I think the blowing a 3-1 lead critique is absurd is because Kobe had likely the best playoff game of his career in Game 6. Down the stretch, Kobe was consistently hitting insanely tough shots that the Lakers absolutely had to have. And on the night, he finished the game with 50 points, 8 rebounds, 5 assists, and 3 steals on a stellar 66.4 true shooting percentage. The Lakers should have won that game as well. The Lakers were up by 3 points with only seconds left in regulation, but Los Angeles consistently blew opportunities to secure the loose ball and the defensive rebound. And as a result, Tim Thomas hits a 3 to tie the game, which sends it to overtime. If the Lakers secure that rebound, they win the series, and Kobe is being praised as a hero for one of the greatest playoff performances of all time. But because Lamar Odom didn't box out for that board, the Lakers go on to lose, and Kobe is blamed for blowing a 3-1 lead. Isn't it crazy how one moment completely unconnected to the superstar player can decide the narrative about that superstar player? There is the highly debated topic about Kobe quitting in Game 7, which I personally don't believe he did, which involves an in-depth explanation and will eventually get its own video. Point being, Kobe didn't blow the series based on his play in the final 3 games, and the Lakers were never considered the better team in the first place. So to critique him for, quote, blowing a 3-1 lead seems a little unfair when you consider the circumstances of that series. So what do you guys think? What is a basketball critique that drives you insane? A couple videos ago, I talked about a few critiques that drive me insane. I broke down what I believe are ridiculous and misleading narratives about some of the greatest players of all time. Honestly, most of that video was me simply defending these legends for some of the weaker critiques thrown against them. Now with that being said, no basketball player is perfect, and every athlete has some weaknesses. So today, I'm looking at those same 3 NBA legends and breaking down what I believe are the actual legitimate criticisms of their careers. First off, LeBron James and the 2011 NBA Finals. After trying to win a championship for 7 years in Cleveland, LeBron shook the basketball world by joining Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh in Miami. Immediately, the expectations were extremely high, but LeBron didn't do himself any favors when predicting at least 8 championships prior to the season starting. The comment from LeBron did come across like it was a bit tongue-in-cheek, but regardless, the narrative was being established early on that a healthy Miami team would have no excuses for failing to win a championship. Despite their talent, the Heat got off to a rocky start, opening the season with a 9-8 record. It was soon after that where they began to hit their stride, and they eventually finished the regular season with a 58-24 record. They cruised their way to the NBA Finals, winning the first round, the second round, and the Eastern Conference Finals in 5 games apiece. With the Dallas Mavericks standing in their path, the Heat were now sitting as the clear favorites to win the NBA championship. If LeBron played at a level even remotely close to his usual expectations, then Miami likely wins that series. As you all know, that's not what happened though. At times, he almost appeared as if he was afraid of the moment and was scared to shoot the basketball. Regardless of his reluctance, he still found a way to lead all players in turnovers over the course of the series. In those finals, LeBron averaged a disappointing 17.8 points, 7.2 rebounds, and 6.8 assists on 47.8% shooting. His worst performance came in Game 4, which was a very winnable game for Miami, as Dallas won with a final score of 86-83. On the night, LeBron played nearly 46 minutes of the game, and he finished with only 8 points on 3 of 11 shooting from the field. At the time I'm currently making this video, LeBron is on a streak of 1,151 regular season games with at least 10 points, which is easily the longest streak in NBA history. This streak began well before the 2011 NBA Finals. The fact that LeBron is actively on such a remarkable streak makes it even more mind-blowing that he managed to score only 8 points in an NBA Finals game where they could have easily taken a 3-1 lead in the series. No matter how long James plays, regardless of his impressive stats, and regardless of what he accomplishes before he retires, this ugly moment of his career will always be a part of his legacy. Kobe Bryant and the 2004 NBA Finals. As someone who closely followed the career of the Mamba, I'm actually quite surprised by how rarely he's criticized for this series, as I believe it's the biggest stain on his basketball career. I'm not mincing words when I say that Kobe Bryant was the biggest reason the Lakers lost this series, other than the simple fact that Detroit was a really great team. Before I get into what Kobe did that sabotaged his own team's chances, let me first provide a little bit of context. The Lakers began the 2003 to 2004 season with their major acquisitions of Karl Malone and Gary Payton. Although both of these stars were in the twilight of their careers, they were still performing at an all-star level when the Lakers signed them. With now 4 stars in Los Angeles' starting lineup, many people were predicting these Lakers to challenge the Bulls' 72-10 record. It was also understood amongst the team that in order to be successful, sacrifices would have to be made, as these stars would have to share the basketball with one another. With that being said, the season ended up being much rockier than originally expected. Throughout the regular season, the beef between Kobe and Shaq had reached an all-time high of toxicity, as both players began taking subtle jabs at one another through media interviews. On top of that, each player's ego was being challenged consistently by one another, as both players strongly desired to be known as the leader of the Lakers. Through all of the drama and the chemistry issues, the Lakers still managed to finish the regular season with a solid 56-26 record. Yet considering their preseason expectations, that record almost felt like a disappointment. The Lakers fought and clawed their way to the NBA Finals, where the defensively dominant Detroit Pistons were waiting, but at that point, the Lakers were still considered the favorites in the matchup. Now understand, at this time in history, most people in the basketball community still saw Shaq as the engine that drove the Lakers. One of the major reasons for this was the fact that Shaq had won the Finals MVP in all 3 of their title runs, while Kobe simply observed during the ceremony. Given their massive ego battle, Kobe presumably wanted his own Finals MVP. If he was going to assert himself as the man in Los Angeles over O'Neal, then Kobe was likely going to need to win the Finals MVP to sway the narrative in his favor. So when Game 1 started in Los Angeles, Kobe immediately started playing as if all he cared about was the Finals MVP. As a close spectator of that series, I can testify to the fact that the Mamba wasn't playing within the flow of the team's offense, and was forcing up shot after shot. You don't have to take my word for it, take the word of one of Kobe's former teammates. At the time, the Lakers' backup shooting guard was a young player named Kareem Rush. In May of the year 2020, Rush said in an interview that Kobe, quote, selfishly wanted the MVP. He was really itching to get that MVP, and we got caught off guard by a better team. Game 1 was all the heads up you need on how this series was going to play out. Kobe took 27 shots in the first game and only converted 37% of them, while Shaq made 13 of his far fewer 16 field goal attempts, which is 81.3% from the field. On the series as a whole, Kobe took 29 more shots than Shaquille O'Neal, despite the fact that the Mamba was only shooting 38.1%, while Shaq was making 63.1% of his shots. To me, this is the worst criticism of Kobe's career, and a completely justified one at that, as he put his own selfish desires ahead of what was best for the team. And instead of changing course when it clearly wasn't working, Kobe just kept forcing it up throughout the entirety of the series. If it wasn't for his immaturity in this series, who knows? Maybe he would have retired with 6 rings on his fingers instead of 5. Next up, Michael Jordan and the 1995 playoffs. The thing that bothers me the most about this semifinal series is the fact that the biggest Jordan stans pretend that it never happened. Yes, Michael Jordan went 6-0 in the NBA Finals, but it's not like he never lost after he started winning championships in 1991. Once again, let me provide some context. The Chicago Bulls had won 3 straight championships from 1991 to 1993, and after the tragic passing of his father that offseason, Jordan felt inspired to leave the game of basketball and begin his career as a baseball player. Due to this, Michael Jordan was completely absent from the 93 to 94 NBA season. Regardless, his Chicago Bulls were still very competitive, as they won 55 games throughout the regular season and even made it as far as the Eastern Conference semifinals. But the following season, the Bulls were struggling. Meanwhile, Jordan's itch to return to basketball was becoming too strong for him to resist, and with only 17 games left in the regular season, MJ made his return to a Bulls team with a 34-31 record. Jordan's first game back was rough, as they lost to the Indiana Pacers while Jordan shot 7 of 28 from the field. He wouldn't appear rusty for very long though. In his 5th game back, Jordan dropped 55 points on the New York Knicks while shooting 56.8% from the field. Instantly, people were believing that the Bulls were championship contenders once again. After getting past the first round of the playoffs, they were matched up against the first-seeded Orlando Magic, who were bolstering a 3-headed monster of Shaquille O'Neal, Penny Hardaway, and Jordan's former teammate Horace Grant. The Bulls went on to lose Game 1, and the manner in which they did it was what stung the most. With only 18 seconds left in the fourth quarter, the Bulls were up by 1 point, seemingly in a commanding position of the game. Unfortunately for MJ, he had one of the most unclutch moments of his career, as he blindly had the ball stolen from him by Nick Anderson, which led to a fast break dunk by Horace Grant, securing the lead for Orlando. With a chance to redeem himself with late game heroics, Michael Jordan turned the ball over yet again with a bad pass intended for Scottie Pippen. On the night, Jordan had 19 points on 8 of 22 shooting and a whopping 8 turnovers. This was a crucial game where the Bulls could have stolen home court advantage from Orlando right out of the gates. The thing is, after this performance in games 2 through 6, Jordan was basically his old self, as he put up monstrous averages of 33.4 points, 6.8 rebounds, and 3.8 assists on 49.6% shooting. With that being said, the Bulls ultimately still lost the series in 6 games. If I'm being honest, this was my least favorite part of the Last Dance documentary, because for this entire segment, it was basically Jordan and his physical trainer making excuses for why they lost the series. The biggest excuse was that Jordan wasn't in basketball shape and was still in his baseball shape. The thing is, this wasn't the narrative when Jordan was dropping 55 in Madison Square Garden. When Jordan was putting up these numbers in games 2 through 6 against Orlando, he didn't look like a baseball player. He was performing at the same level of greatness that he was accustomed to. The truth is, the Bulls didn't lose because of Jordan's baseball excuse. They lost because they no longer had an inside presence like they did in their first three-peat. Horace Grant was now on the other side of the court, averaging 18 points and 11 rebounds on 65% shooting for the Orlando Magic. No matter how much Jordan, his trainer, and the Jordan stans want to act like this series didn't count, it did. They were simply beat by the better team, and when Jordan had the opportunity to steal a crucial game in Orlando, he choked, plain and simple. The funny thing is, even if Jordan's baseball excuse was the reason the Bulls lost the series, that's still not a legitimate excuse, because that's no one's fault other than his own. He was the one who decided to come back to basketball with only 17 games left in the regular season. The Orlando Magic didn't make him do that, so don't try to invalidate their victory. And just like how Jordan ignored the fact that Horace Grant was the real reason they lost in '95, the Last Dance doc also failed to mention that Horace Grant got injured in Game 1 of the 1996 series, where the Bulls executed their revenge. At that moment, Grant was lost for the rest of the series. Now don't get me wrong, I still think a 72-10 Bulls would have beat a 64-win Orlando Magic team even with a healthy Horace Grant. But at the very least, if you're gonna go on about your excuses for your loss in 1995, then don't ignore the excuses of the other team in '96. If your favorite player is Michael Jordan, my bit of advice is just take the L on the 1995 series. You personally can still view MJ as the greatest player of all time, while acknowledging that at least one time after he began his championship reign in the NBA, he and the Bulls legitimately failed to get it done. My heart behind making this video is to show that there is ways to legitimately criticize even the greatest players of all time. But hopefully, this video also serves as an encouraging reminder that it's always possible to bounce back from monumental failures, as all 3 of these incredible legends went on to achieve amazing things after their significant failures. So a recent theme of this channel has been the topic of defense. And while I was considering what videos I should make, I realized that I've never done the top 10 DPOY seasons in NBA history. So that's where this video comes in, starting with number 10, Alonzo Mourning in 1999. He was 28 years old and playing for the Miami Heat, and this guy usually isn't appreciated enough as being one of the greatest rim protectors in the history of the game. For myself personally, I think he should have made it into the top 75 greatest players of all time. And his peak season defensively was in 1999, when he averaged 0.7 steals and a monstrous 3.9 blocks. It was a lockout-shortened season, so I think this year doesn't usually get as much respect as it deserves. But he did play in 46 out of the 50 games that year. He was 4th in defensive win shares, and thanks to his leadership, Miami finished 1st in the Atlantic Division with a 33-17 record. Alonso got postered plenty of times in his career, but that was because he was the epitome of aggressive on defense, as he challenged everything as the rim protector. And if you ask me, that's the kind of teammate you want on your side down low. Number 9. Alvin Robertson in 1986. This San Antonio Spurs legend was one of the most feisty players to ever play on the perimeter. At this point, he was 27 years old, and he averaged a monstrous 3.7 steals, which is an NBA record to this very day. But that wasn't all that he did. That would be crazy enough in itself, but he also averaged 0.5 blocks, which is actually quite impressive, especially for a 6'4" guard. He had availability as he played in 78 of the 82 regular season games. He was 2nd in defensive plus-minus, and among all players who received DPOY votes, Robertson was the leader in defensive win shares. His Spurs barely made it to the playoffs with a 35-47 record, but that wasn't his fault, as he was an absolute pest on the perimeter, and was one of the sole reasons why they were able to win some games. Number 8. Dwight Howard in 2009. Prime Dwight Howard was an absolute menace. He had a gravitational pull both offensively and defensively that was pivotal for the Orlando Magic's success, and that year they had plenty of it, as they finished the regular season with a 59-23 record. On the year, he averaged 1 steal and 2.9 blocks. He was able to get those blocks because of his quickness and because of his insane athleticism, equipped with tremendous leaping ability. He was also dominant in advanced analytics, as he was 1st overall in defensive rating and 1st overall in defensive win shares. Thanks to Dwight's interior impact, they finished with the number 1 ranked defense in the entire league, and that wouldn't have been anywhere close to possible without him. Number 7. Dikembe Mutombo in 1995. Mount Mutombo was an absolute force, especially as a member of the Denver Nuggets, and this season happened to be his absolute peak of his defensive abilities. On the year, he averaged 0.5 steals and 3.9 blocks per game. He was the defensive anchor of that squad, and he contested absolutely everything, and I'm sure he provided plenty of nightmares to opposing offensive players, as he was always sure to cap off his blocked shots with his iconic finger wag. Dikembe had a ridiculously long wingspan, so even for the ones he didn't get a piece of, he certainly altered its trajectory, and for his impact, I believe he certainly deserves a spot on my list. Number 6. Draymond Green in 2017. Unless you play at the center position, it's certainly hard to crack this top 10. But Draymond Green's performance in their historic 2017 season is certainly worth it in my opinion. The Warriors absolutely dominated that season and finished the year with a 67-15 record. They were also ranked 2nd defensively in the league, and most of that credit belongs to their defensive leader, Draymond Green. On the year, he averaged 2 steals and an impressive 1.4 blocks. He was 2nd in defensive win shares and 2nd overall in defensive rating, while being 1st overall in defensive plus-minus. He did a little bit of everything for that squad defensively, and he also deserves a ton of credit for his defensive IQ and for his verbal leadership on that end. Number 5. David Robinson in 1992. This Spurs team may have only finished with a 47-35 record, but that doesn't change the fact that they had the best defense statistically in the entire league, and we all know who deserves the majority of that credit. On the year, he averaged 2.3 steals and a ridiculous 4.5 blocks. That is the highest combination average of blocks and steals in NBA history. He also had the best defensive plus-minus and by far the best defensive rating in the entire league. I've actually seen some lists that rank David Robinson as high as the number 1 spot among the greatest DPOYs of all time. But for myself personally, he only played in 68 of the 82 regular season games, which honestly kept him from being even higher on my list. Because as I've said time and time again, you can only have a defensive impact for the games that you're actually out there, and for 14 games that year, he provided nothing. Number 4. Dennis Rodman in 1991. As usual, Rodman didn't have gaudy stats by any means, but what 91 Rodman did have is arguably the greatest on-ball defense from any player in NBA history. He always played with 100% effort, and he had an endless motor to back it up, as he was simply one of the most athletic players to ever live. He finished 4th overall in defensive rating, and as usual, Rodman was among the league leaders in defensive rebounding. The Detroit Pistons also allowed the fewest points per game of any team that season. And again, we all know where the majority of that credit belongs. Number 3. Mark Eaton in 1985. This 7'4" monster was 28 years old at this point, and although he was usually among the greatest defensive players in the game, this season specifically was especially special. He played all 82 games that year, and on the year, he averaged 0.4 steals and an NBA record 5.6 blocks. That was more than doubled the second place runner-up, which just happened to be one of the other greatest rim protectors of all time, Hakeem Olajuwon. Despite having only a 41-41 record, Utah still had the best defense in the entire league statistically, and that was thanks to the incredible impact of their center down low. Mark was 1st in defensive rating, and he was also 1st in defensive plus-minus. Along with that, he was 1st overall in defensive win shares. Simply put, he's one of the most underrated and underappreciated rim protectors of all time. And without question, his 1985 campaign was utterly ridiculous. Number 2. Ben Wallace in 2003. He was in his late 20s, and he was making his ascension defensively right as the Detroit Pistons were becoming one of the greatest defensive teams of all time. They were led by Wallace, who was one of the strongest and most intimidating centers of all time. On the year, he averaged 1.4 steals and 3.2 blocks, while commanding tons of respect down low. He also averaged a remarkable 11.4 defensive rebounds per game, which was 1st in the league overall. He was also 1st in defensive win shares, 1st in defensive plus-minus, and 1st overall in defensive rating. Whether it was the eye test, the basic stats, or the advanced stats, Wallace simply dominated that season to a historic extent. With a 50-32 record, the Pistons finished with the best record in the Eastern Conference, as they were allowing the fewest points per game that season. I debated whether or not this should go in the 1st or 2nd spot, but this is what I settled on after splitting some hairs. Here is my list of honorable mentions. Should any of these players have made the top 10 instead? Number 1. Hakeem Olajuwon in 1993. Hakeem isn't just one of the greatest defensive players and one of the greatest rim protectors of all time, but he's in the argument for being the greatest defensive player of all time. And for what he did in 1993, he's certainly worthy of a top 2 spot in my mind. At the time, he was 30 years old, and he was one of the greatest pickpockets in the entire league, not just at the center position, as he averaged a whopping 1.8 steals, to go along with his tremendous 4.2 blocks. He also accumulated the 2nd most defensive rebounds that season. What is now unheard of by modern NBA standards, he played all 82 games in that regular season. His Rockets finished with a 55-27 record. He was 2nd in defensive rating and 2nd overall in defensive win shares. If you ask me, he's also one of the most versatile defensive players of all time, as he had the speed and lateral quickness to keep up with even some of the perimeter players who challenged him. He had every kind of block shot in his arsenal, whether it was as the main defender, the help defender, or with chase down blocks. Some may argue otherwise, but for myself personally, I think the Dream is deserving of the number 1 spot. So today's video is going to be a little bit different and a little bit random, but I thought it would be a cool way to share some of my thoughts, share some of my experiences, and connect with you guys a little bit, because I want to hear your feedback as well. These are the top 5 games in NBA history that I regret missing. And what I mean by that is that I didn't see them live as they happened. I'm not talking about being in the stands and watching the game in person, because that rarely happened in my life. But I'm talking about sitting in front of a TV, experiencing everything as it went down, being in the moment, and living the excitement as it happened. And please, let me know in the comments below, what are the games that you regret missing live and not seeing as it happened? I'm not looking to cast any judgment or any condemnation for whatever people might have to say. Sometimes, life just doesn't allow you to do what you'd rather be doing. So that's what we're talking about. So let me get things started with number 5. January 13th, 2015, Kings versus the Warriors. For those of you who haven't figured it out yet, this was the game that Klay Thompson scored 37 points in a single quarter. I think it's going to be true that most of us, outside of Warriors fans, didn't see this game as it went down. With that being said, I did live in Northern California at this point, so I had a lot of Warriors fans in my life. The reason it frustrates me that I missed seeing this game live is because not only did Klay Thompson set the NBA record by scoring 37 points in a single quarter, but it was arguably the best 12 minutes of individual offensive basketball in the history of the game. He went 13 of 13 from the field, many of those shots were three-pointers, and many of them had no business going in, but he was simply unconscious. I've grown up seeing many great players like Kobe Bryant, Michael Jordan, LeBron James, Carmelo Anthony, Kevin Durant, all kinds of great offensive scorers. And I've never seen a guy be as blistering hot as Klay Thompson was on that evening. And when I say that, obviously I'm talking about his highlight reel and watching the game in the past. But when you're watching a YouTube video or an ESPN highlight, and you already know heading into it that he achieved history and put up goofy numbers, it just doesn't hit the same to watch each basket go in time and time again. I imagine the people who were in the crowd and who were watching that game live were just dumbfounded and had their jaws hitting the floor with what they were seeing. And personally, I wish I could have experienced that. Honestly, I can't even remember what I was doing that night nearly 10 years ago. But I do remember my buddy texting me saying that Klay Thompson just scored 37 points. And the very next text said, in the third quarter alone. I didn't completely believe it until I saw the highlight reel. Number 4, The Malice at the Palace. This was all the way back in 2004. A lot of people didn't see this game live, but some people did. Even heading into this evening, it was a high-profile competition as you had 2 rivals and 2 Eastern Conference contenders competing in a regular season contest. Now this one kind of has a funny story to it. When I first heard about the Malice at the Palace, I was actually with my parents. My dad was driving, my mom was in the passenger seat, and we were listening to ESPN radio. And while that was on, they talked about the brawl going down that evening. And then they played a soundbite of the commentators calling the radio broadcast, explaining the commotion and the chaos that ensued. I remember sitting in the back seat, listening to what was going on and thinking to myself, there is no freaking way that this brawl was nearly as crazy as it sounds. It just sounds like utter chaos and the most wild thing that's ever happened in a professional basketball game. Sure enough, when I got home, I turned on ESPN and I saw the highlights, if you can call them that, more like lowlights, basically on repeat, and was just utterly shocked at what happened. Obviously, it was ugly, it was embarrassing for the NBA, but as a basketball historian, I understand just how impactful this night was on the shaping of the league. And from that perspective, I really wish I could have seen it live. It was crazy to hear what was going down over the radio, but I can only imagine what I would have been thinking and what my reaction would have been if I had saw Ron Artest running into that crowd live, and everything that came afterwards. Number 3, March 8th, 2013, Lakers versus Raptors. So here's what you need to know. I'm a huge Lakers fan and I'm a huge Kobe Bryant fan. I used to religiously watch basically every single Lakers game. Kobe's 62 3/4, I saw it. Kobe's 81-point game, I saw that. Kobe's 4 straight 50-point games, I saw all of those. Kobe's 9 games of 40 straight points, I saw those too. Kobe's 12 3-pointers against the Seattle Supersonics, I saw that record game as well. I honestly believe I've seen 95% of Kobe Bryant's games throughout his career just because that's how big of a Lakers fan I was. There was very few exceptions I made when there was a Laker game on that evening. This was one of the few of them, as I was taking my girlfriend at the time out on a date that night. I remember we had dinner, but ultimately it didn't work out, and within a couple months she was no longer with me. And guess what? That resulted in me missing arguably the most clutch Kobe Bryant performance of all time. Talk about regret. This was the game where he made 3 ridiculous three-point shots as the fourth quarter was coming to a close. And if Kobe missed any one of these single three-point shots, the Lakers lose this game. Then he went on into overtime and converted the game-winning dunk to seal the victory. This might just seem like a random regular season game against Toronto, but Kobe was in the midst of turning the Lakers season around and was dragging the underachieving 2012 to 2013 Lakers to the NBA playoffs, kicking and screaming. His numbers that evening were utterly ridiculous, and I remember for a short while he was in the MVP conversation. People who weren't closely following the Lakers that season really don't realize just how great Kobe was, despite the fact that they barely got into the playoffs just after he tore his Achilles. Ultimately, it was one of the best games of Kobe's career and one of the most clutch and meaningful regular season games that's ever been. Number 2. Game 5 of the 1997 NBA Finals, aka the flu game. Now obviously, missing an NBA Finals game is just crazy. But what you need to understand is that when you're an NBA superfan who's only 7 years old, you don't really make that many decisions for yourself. My dad was at work providing a livelihood for the family, and my mom had planned us to take a visit to go see my grandmother, who unfortunately didn't even have a television. Back at that time, I didn't have a smartphone, I didn't have access to the internet, there was basically no way I could know what was going on. And then one of the most historic, clutch, and epic performances of all time happened from the player who most people believe is the greatest of all time. I didn't find out what happened until I saw the newspaper the following day. Given the fact that I was only 7, I'm not sure what I could have really done to change that outcome, but I really wish I could have seen that game as it happened. Number 1. Game 7 of the 2016 NBA Finals. This one kills me. It embarrasses me to even admit that I never saw this game. It almost feels like an indictment on the quality of a basketball fan that I am. But the truth is, I didn't have a choice, and the fact that I missed this game actually helped shape my career. I'll explain. So obviously, as you guys all know, the Warriors got ahead of LeBron James and the Cleveland Cavaliers 3-1 in the NBA Finals. And that's when Kyrie and LeBron both stepped up and charged back to force a Game 7. There was only one problem. Before I started my YouTube channel, I was actually doing construction, and we were doing it for a private school. We were working on a classroom where students were scheduled to be there the next day. So because of this project had to get done that day. Unfortunately, we were running behind schedule. And given the fact that I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area, all of the guys on that job wanted to get the job done in a timely fashion. Then it's 2 p.m., then 3 p.m., then 4 p.m., and we still have a lot of things left on our plate. 5 p.m., 6 p.m. We are working as hard as we can, trying to get as much done as we can, but at that point, the writing was in the wall. And as a basketball fan, it was one of the most frustrating and depressing nights that I can possibly remember. We didn't end up finishing the job until 11:30 p.m., well after the game was over. I drove home trying not to get any updates. I tried to find a replay of the game, couldn't find it anywhere. So finally, I settled for watching a YouTube highlight and saw what happened in a matter of 5 minutes. It was at that point that I decided my job needs to be something centered around the NBA, because I don't ever want to miss a game like this ever again. And it was around that time that I first started thinking about starting this YouTube channel, and now it's my career. So I guess it all turned out alright, but the fact that I didn't see arguably the greatest NBA Finals game in NBA history does haunt me quite a bit. So now it's your guys' turn. What is a game that you didn't get to see live that still haunts you to this day? I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments section below. Throughout the years, there have been many great rim protectors who have played in the game of basketball. And today, we're looking at my top 5 greatest of all time. They're guys who primarily played at the center position, and I'm looking at their stats, their consistency, their longevity, their peak performance, and their impact on the court. So without further ado, let's get into it. Number 5, Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain. I know, it seems crazy to have these two guys sharing the 5th spot. For one, Bill Russell is arguably the greatest defensive player in the history of the game, and Wilt Chamberlain was known for getting so many blocked shots that he probably would be the all-time record holder for most blocks in a season, most blocks in a career, and highest blocks per game average if they had tracked his stats in that era. The thing is, that's a lot of what ifs. The only information we have on Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain is a very limited amount of footage and very few defensive numbers. We don't have blocks or steals, we don't have data on how they impacted players around the rim, and there's very few full games that we can watch of their impact. So although I certainly believe that they belong on this list, it's hard for me to put them ahead of everyone else when there's so little data to back that up. So for me, they'll have to share the 5th spot. Number 4, David Robinson. The Admiral was simply one of the greatest shot blockers and defensive players that the history of basketball has ever seen. He averaged a whopping 3 blocks over the course of his career, and he got as high as 4.5 blocks in the 91-92 season. He also made a whopping 8 all-defense teams, as this 7'1" beast had strength, length, and plenty of athleticism. He was also quick and able to cover a ton of ground in a short amount of time. He was the leader in blocks per game for only 1 season in his career, and a lot of that had to do with the ridiculously stiff competition of the 1990s. But regardless, he's simply one of the greatest defensive players of all time, and in his first 3 seasons in the league combined, he averaged well over 4 blocks per game. To put it simply, a defense is always going to be elite when you have this guy as the anchor down low. Number 3, Mark Eaton. Now Mark didn't have the greatest longevity, and he isn't as high on the all-time block shots list as he could have been, simply for the fact that he was nearly 26 years old when he was an NBA rookie. But as soon as he got into the league, he was immediately a major problem for opposing offenses. He averaged 3.4 blocks per game in his rookie season, and he actually led the NBA in block shots 4 times in his career, getting as high as a goofy 5.6 in 1985. That is the highest single-season blocks per game average in NBA history, and he was also named the Defensive Player of the Year that season. He would also go on to be the Defensive Player of the Year in 1989 as well. Standing at 7 foot 4 inches tall, this guy was an absolute monster in the paint, and wasn't just swatting shots, but was constantly disrupting plenty of them. He made 5 all-defense teams in his career as well, and alongside of Karl Malone, he was regularly a nightmare for anyone who dared to challenge him. He didn't have the greatest speed and quickness, but with his size, with his length, and with his intelligent basketball IQ, he certainly made up for it and some. Number 2, Dikembe Mutombo. Mount Mutombo was the epitome of an aggressive player in the painted area, as he went after everything, constantly contesting shots and blocking plenty of them. He made 6 all-defense teams in his career, but 4 of those seasons he was the Defensive Player of the Year. His 4 DPOY trophies is tied for the most in NBA history, and along with that, he led the NBA in blocked shots 3 times in his career, getting as high as 4.5 in the 95-96 season with the Denver Nuggets. He played for many different teams throughout his career, but there was never a time where Mutombo wasn't having an impact defensively. And as far as his defense goes, that aged extremely graciously, as he even won the Defensive Player of the Year trophy in 2001 when he was in his mid-30s. His ridiculous length made him an absolute nightmare, and he was even a highlight machine on defense, as he was always wrapping up the blocked shot with his iconic finger wag. One can only imagine how many block shots he would have averaged if he played in the 1980s when very few perimeter shots were taken. Number 1, Hakeem Olajuwon. Yes, the Dream had the length and the size just like many of the guys on this list, but unlike the rest of the guys on this list, Olajuwon was also extremely agile and very quick. which allowed him to make up ground very fast and contest even perimeter slashers who beat him off the dribble. Hakeem could do every kind of block shot. He could protect the rim, he could do chase down blocks, and he was excellent as a help defender. He was an absolute nightmare on the defensive end as he won 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards, he made 9 All-Defense teams, and he led the NBA in block shots in 3 separate seasons in his career. He got as high as 4.6 blocks per game in the 89-90 season. And thanks to his tremendous consistency and longevity, he is the all-time leader in block shots by a country mile. Given the fact that the game has changed in recent years, and there's now more perimeter shots being taken, which means less opportunities to block shots, I really have a hard time seeing anyone challenge Hakeem as the greatest shot blocker of all time anytime soon. Here is my list of honorable mentions. Should any of these tremendous shot blockers have made my top 5 instead? I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments section below. Basketball is a game defined by moments. With just one shot, a player's legacy can be redefined for decades to come. Throughout the years, the greats have hit plenty of clutch shots that have been ingrained into our memories. But what about the ones that were not as fortunate? Today, we're looking at some of the most significant single shots of league history and pondering what could have been if that shot had actually gone in. First, let me make this very clear. This is not a rankings list of the most significant shots, and this video doesn't contain all the great what-if shots either, just some of them. There's plenty more of these shots to address, so if you enjoy this video, let me know and I can make more of them in the future. So without further ado, let's get into it. Vince Carter in Game 7 of the 2001 Eastern Conference Semifinals. This series was one of the great individual playoff battles of league history, as both Allen Iverson and Vince Carter were each in the prime of their careers. Several times, each star had exploded for at least 50 points during the series, and now the stars would clash for one last time in a 7th and deciding game in Philadelphia. Almost all of you know the result of this series, as Allen Iverson's 76ers famously made it to the NBA Finals and stole a game from the previously undefeated Los Angeles Lakers, which was sealed with his iconic jumper over Tyronn Lue. In an instant, Iverson's most iconic moment was nearly wiped from history, as it was a 1-point game with only 2 seconds left and Toronto was inbounding the ball. Vince got the ball, and after a great pump fake, he had a surprisingly clean look at the basket, but just missed. If Carter hits that shot, it sends the Raptors to the Eastern Conference Finals and completely changes both his and Allen Iverson's legacy. There's no guarantee that Toronto would have been able to get past a strong Milwaukee Bucks team in the Eastern Conference Finals. But if they did, there's a possibility that the roles would have been reversed, and the respect and adoration we have for Iverson's effort in the 01 Finals would have now gone to Carter, as he would have had his own shot against the Shaq and Kobe Lakers. Robert Horry in Game 5 of the 2003 Western Conference Semifinals. When it comes to Big Shot Bob, we've become so accustomed to seeing his highlights of him hitting the biggest shots when they mattered most. But unfortunately, this monumental shot is all you need to know that everyone has their highs and their lows. As we reflect on basketball history, we know that the San Antonio Spurs were the 2003 NBA champions, as Tim Duncan had his greatest playoff series of his career and one of the greatest finals performances of league history. But one single shot had that all in serious jeopardy. It was in the West semifinals where the Lakers and Spurs were tied at 2 games apiece, in a battle of a pivotal 5th game in San Antonio. The Lakers weren't just defending their title, but they were attempting to win their 4th straight championship, while the Spurs were on the verge of winning their 2nd and their 1st of the new decade. The Lakers had rallied from a major deficit, and Kobe had the ball with only 10 seconds left in the game, with all-time great defender Bruce Bowen all over him. When he kicked it to Horry, I thought for sure it was going in, and it was about as close as it possibly could have been, right as time was expiring. If Horry hits this shot, then the Lakers lead the series heading into Game 6. If they end up eliminating the Spurs, then there's a good chance they go all the way to the finals and defeat the New Jersey Nets, which is the same team they swept out of the previous finals. In the big picture, this would mean that Kobe would have 6 championship rings, equaling him to Michael Jordan's total. Tim Duncan would have only 4, and Shaq and Kobe would have won 4 straight titles, which is a feat that not even Jordan and Pippen accomplished, but only Bill Russell's Celtics in the 1960s. To simply say that the shot had a significant impact on NBA history would be a massive understatement. Larry Bird in Game 4 of the 1987 NBA Finals. It was the final matchup of the decade between the greatest rivals of NBA history, Magic Johnson's Lakers and Larry Bird's Celtics. Boston was in a must-win situation as they were down in the series 2-1. It was an exciting game throughout, and the final couple minutes had numerous lead changes. Magic hit one of the most iconic shots of finals history as he drilled the baby skyhook over the outstretched arm of Kevin McHale. The Lakers were now up by 1 point, but it was Larry Bird who would get the final opportunity to take the game. With the inbounds pass coming to him, Larry would have the chance to make the same shot he made just a couple plays earlier. But unfortunately for Boston, it was just a bit long, and the Lakers won the game, taking a commanding 3-1 lead. If Larry hit that shot, this series would have been tied at 2 games apiece, and assuming the rest of the series plays out the same way, Boston would have won Game 5 and the Lakers win Game 6, meaning there would have been a 7th and deciding game. In this scenario, if the Celtics go on to defeat the Lakers in 7 games, then Larry Bird's final ring count would have been 4, and Magic Johnson's final ring count would have been 4 as well, which honestly seems like a more fitting and poetic way for the equally great rivals to have ended their NBA careers. John Stockton in Game 6 of the 1998 NBA Finals. Everyone knows about this series and about this sequence as Michael Jordan hit the championship-winning shot with 5.2 seconds remaining. The thing is, John Stockton was a great three-point shooter and had just hit a clutch three-pointer just a few moments earlier. With Ron Harper defending him, Stockton got a decent look and came up just short on what would have been the game-winning basket, which would have tied the series at 3 games apiece and forced a Game 7 in Utah. Now I know Jordan's stance will act like there's no possible way Jordan could have lost a Game 7 in the NBA Finals. And if that's you, then I don't blame you for being so convinced of that, but at least consider the circumstances for a minute. If John Stockton hits that shot and forces Game 7, then they would have been playing in Utah, where the Jazz had won 3 out of their 4 home games against the Bulls that season. Also consider that Scottie Pippen was dealing with major back problems throughout Game 6, so it's questionable whether or not he would have been available for Game 7. And even if he was, would he have had that much of a positive impact in his condition? Then you factor in that Jordan was 35 years old and was absolutely exhausted from carrying his team offensively in Game 6, as he scored 45 of his Bulls' 87 points on 35 shot attempts. If push comes to shove, I may have bet on Michael Jordan in Game 7, but if Stockton makes that shot in Game 6, anything would have been possible. Patrick Ewing in Game 7 of the 1995 Eastern Conference Semifinals. Maybe this isn't the most impactful shot from a big picture standpoint, but for Knicks fans who were old enough to witness it, this one still hurts to this day. Back then, Reggie Miller and his Indiana Pacers had a fierce and physical rivalry with Patrick Ewing's Knicks, as this was the 3rd straight season that the two teams met up in the East playoffs. It's down to the final 30 seconds, and after a ridiculously clutch and difficult 3 by John Starks, Indiana's lead is cut down to just 2 points. Then after Mark Jackson's miss, the Knicks secure the rebound and have the opportunity to push the game to overtime. With 5 seconds left, New York inbounds the ball to their best player, Patrick Ewing, and after a spin move, he's met with very little resistance at the rim, but blows the biggest layup of his life. If Ewing made this layup, then his legacy changes forever, as this blown layup is the most memorable play that sums up his reputation as a choker. The Knicks also would have had the last laugh in one of the greatest rivalries of the 90s, and they would have gone on to face the talented Orlando Magic in the East Finals. Although it's unlikely that the Knicks would have gone on to defeat the Magic and then also the Rockets in the NBA Finals, regardless, it still has fans in the Big Apple asking themselves, what if? So now it's your turn. What was a missed shot that still has you asking, what if? In the last 30 years, the game of basketball has changed quite a bit from the league I once knew, some ways for the better and in some ways for the worse. But one of the constants has been the fact that the league is ran by its superstars. Superstars who either adapted or completely revolutionized the way the game is played with their unique styles. But now my question is, how would the superstars of today's game adapt and perform within the gritty and slower paced era of the 1990s? Who are the stars who would really thrive in that instance? Today, I've narrowed my list down to 5 players who would almost certainly give the legends of the 1990s something to sweat about. First off, DeMar DeRozan. This one probably comes as no surprise, as he not only had an all-star caliber year with Chicago, but DeRozan is often compared to Michael Jordan in terms of his footwork and his mid-range artistry. DeRozan loves to catch the ball in the post and go to work from there with his wide variety of post moves. Recently, he has improved quite significantly from three-point range, but throughout the vast majority of his career, he hasn't been an efficient three-point shooter, which honestly makes him even better suited to play in the 90s rather than in this modern era. Some might get upset about this next take, but let's be honest, outside of Michael Jordan, the shooting guard position in the 1990s wasn't quite the deepest position. Although there were some notable stars, rarely were they also great defensive players. And with many of those two guards being undersized, a 6'6" and offensively disciplined DeRozan would certainly take advantage of the exploitable matchups. Next up is Kyrie Irving. He's arguably the greatest ball handler in NBA history, which would certainly work well in the 1990s, where players like Tim Hardaway and Allen Iverson made names for themselves. Not only is Kyrie fundamentally sound, but back in the 90s, the referees wouldn't let players get away with as much in terms of movement and ball handling, like Euro steps, loose gather steps, and so on. As time has gone on, the game has been called less strictly, and a lot of today's highlights would be quickly called as turnovers 30 years ago. This is where Kyrie stands out, as a player like him would have the control and the ball handling skills to quickly adapt to these new obstacles. Next is the Joker, Nikola Jokic. Obviously, being at the center position in the 1990s means you'll be dealing with plenty of competition, with guys like Shaquille O'Neal, Patrick Ewing, David Robinson, Hakeem Olajuwon, Dikembe Mutombo, and Alonzo Mourning as adversaries. But if there's any modern center who's well suited to take on that task, it is indeed the Joker. To be frank, the bigs of the 90s wouldn't know what to do with a center who could facilitate as well as Jokic, but who could also stretch the floor with his perimeter shooting. They're accustomed to playing a bruising and punishing style under the paint, but Jokic would force them to think in ways that they usually don't, and would naturally pull them away from their comfort zone. Jokic wouldn't just dominate on an individual level, but his skills would result in his team dominating as well. By stretching the floor with his perimeter shooting, Jokic would force the great rim protectors of that era to move towards the perimeter, which would then open up the passing lanes and the painted area, which cutting wings would exploit. And there's no better big to find and distribute to those cutters than Jokic himself, considering how he's arguably the greatest passing center of all time. The great bigs of the 90s would try to play physically with Jokic, but considering how he's a career 83% free throw shooter, he wouldn't have many problems with that either. Next is Rudy Gobert. Some of you may find this one as a surprise, but after pondering it for a while, I truly believe he would take advantage of this era with the opportunities given to him. 30 years ago, the NBA was taking roughly 1/5 of the amount of three-pointers that they're taking in today's game. As high school coaches always love to preach, long shots equals long rebounds. With more shots closer to the basket, Gobert's rim protection and rebounding skills would stand out to an even greater extent. As impressive as his rebounding and shot blocking numbers are, I would expect them to get a significant boost if he played in that era. As far as his competition, yes, he would have a difficult time going up against other legendary bigs of the 90s. But honestly, the offensive end has never been Gobert's strongest area on the court anyway, so being limited offensively wouldn't really stop him from excelling at what he's best at, which again is his defense and rebounding. Last on my list is a point guard with a lot of old school style to his game, Chris Paul. Paul is what basketball fans refer to as a true point guard, who plays a game with a style that's within rhythm of the 90s. The majority of the time, he's looking to facilitate first and score second, regardless of the fact that he's a very capable scorer. His style is slow-paced, methodical, and he loves to use plenty of pick and rolls. In the 90s, there just wasn't as much fast break basketball, and instead, much of the offense was executed in half-court sets, which naturally suits his game as he likes to patiently quarterback the offense from the top of the key. It's also worth mentioning that there are plenty of great bigs in the 1990s, whether it be at the center position or the power forward position. Many centers and power forwards have experienced their best years in the NBA when Chris Paul was their point guard, which comes as no surprise considering how good CP3 is with the pick and roll, entry passes, and lob passes. Pair Chris Paul with almost any of these bigs, and they are both likely to have career years as a result. Again, this is analytical, but it's also a speculative topic, so I'm very curious to hear your list as well. Who are the modern players who would dominate in the 1990s? Let me know in the comments section below. So recently, a specific viewer has been asking me for a very specific video, and on several of my videos, he's actually been one of the most liked comments, which tells me that a decent amount of you actually want this as well. So today, I'm putting together what I believe is the ultimate basketball team, not just based on their talent and greatness, but also from the perspective of how well these players would blend together. This is how it works. There's 15 roster spots and I need to pick 3 players for each position. There will be the starters, a second unit, and a third unit, and I'll do my best to explain how these units work together. Also, for those of you who want to take the time, let me know in the comments how you would build your ultimate roster. So without further ado, let's get into it. First off, let's determine who the starters will be. I want a team that works together seamlessly, which means I want ball movement, and I want the best point guard for feeding every superstar teammate that he has. For this reason, I'm taking Magic Johnson as my starting point guard. He's got size, speed, and the crucial ability to make every one of his teammates better. As shooting guard, give me Michael Jordan. He's arguably the greatest scorer in NBA history, and he's probably the greatest defensive two-guard as well. Not only will Jordan be a strong presence for post scoring, but with Magic as a backcourt teammate, there will be constant fast break opportunities, and Jordan is as good as anyone in the open court. Envision all the transition connections between James Worthy and Magic Johnson of the Showtime Lakers, but instead replace Worthy with a tongue-wagging Michael Jordan. With Magic and Jordan at the guards, it's extremely important that my small forward can spread the floor and hit three-point shots consistently, specifically in catch-and-shoot situations. For this purpose, I'm starting Larry Bird at small forward. This might sound crazy to some, but Bird was basically a player with no weakness whatsoever. He was 6'9", he could shoot from anywhere on the court with extreme efficiency, he was an all-time great passer, he was an underrated defensive player, and he was one of the greatest rebounders ever at his position. Some will argue that LeBron should be a starter, and although I respect that take, I think James fits better with the players in my second unit, while Bird's catch-and-shoot abilities are incredibly crucial to the chemistry of my starting group. I'm making an exception at the power forward position, and I'm moving Hakeem Olajuwon from his traditional 5th spot to the 4th spot. Hakeem is a player who is certainly a threat in the mid-range, and he has the speed and agility to keep up with perimeter players and stretch 4s. So I certainly think he has the ability to play the 4 extremely well, and thanks to his experience playing alongside of the 7'4" Ralph Sampson, I'm pretty confident Hakeem would have no issues starting alongside of another all-time great big man. Starting at center will be the 7'2" Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. The captain had one of the most indefensible shots in NBA history, the skyhook, and we know he works in perfect harmony with my starting point guard, Magic Johnson. With Kareem and Hakeem in the starting unit, this team will bolster the most terrifying interior defense that basketball has ever seen. This interior lineup will also be a very familiar situation for Larry Bird, as he's almost always played with 2 big men down low, in Kevin McHale and Robert Parrish. But now, those 2 bigs will be on another level, with Kareem and Hakeem. As I mentioned, Bird's spacing and shooting will be pivotal for this starting lineup, but Jordan could also be a massive help in that area, depending on which version of Jordan I take. In this case, I'll take 1990 Michael Jordan, who was hitting 37.6% of his three-point shots on a top 10 volume of three-point attempts. I'll take this starting 5 against any other starting 5 that you can come up with. So let's get into the second unit. At point guard, give me Steph Curry, as he's the ultimate floor spacer and the greatest three-point threat. At shooting guard, give me Kobe Bryant. Similar to Michael Jordan, he'll be a lethal two-way threat on the perimeter, and if it's needed, Kobe can operate in a slowed down offensive attack and go to work from the post. Personally, I would like this version of Kobe to be the 06 version. It was before his knee surgery, so he still had the elite athleticism, but he had also developed his mid-range and perimeter game to be near unstoppable. At small forward is LeBron James. With Curry and Kobe operating as shoot-first guards, I like LeBron starting at the 3. But let's be honest, in this second unit, LeBron will be operating as the main floor general, despite the fact that Curry holds the title of point guard. LeBron will love to find a slashing Kobe Bryant and a spot-up shooting Steph Curry, giving these 3 players near flawless chemistry for the second unit. For LeBron, I definitely want the 2013 version. That way, his defensive abilities are at their peak, but he also functions as an elite 3-point shooter. At power forward, I'll take Kevin Durant, which gives LeBron even more options of shooters on the perimeter. Just picture the 2017 Golden State Warriors, but instead of Draymond operating as the facilitator, it's a prime LeBron James. And instead of Klay Thompson at the 2, it's a prime Kobe Bryant. It just won't be fair at all. And then, at the center position for the second unit, I'll take a prime Shaquille O'Neal. Obviously, Shaq has that built-in chemistry and experience with Kobe, but Shaq also fits in perfectly with this scary second unit. When O'Neal was in his prime, the defense would frequently collapse upon him, as the defense desperately sent multiple defenders in a feeble attempt to slow him down. When the opposing team inevitably collapsed upon Shaq, he would kick it out to his open shooters, like Rick Fox and Derek Fisher. But now, he'll be kicking it out to shooters like Steph Curry and Kevin Durant. Talk about an upgrade. Honestly, this second unit is so good that you could argue that they should be the starters instead. But the thing is, the starters are usually the ones who close out the final minutes of the game. And I wouldn't want this second unit out there in the closing minutes, because Shaq's free throw shooting is a liability down the stretch. And if the opposing team wanted to execute a hack-a-Shaq strategy, that could certainly affect the dominating nature of this team. Therefore, I think it's wise to keep this second unit as the second unit. Now let's take a look at the third unit. With my starters and with the backups, I established the identity and the style of my team. So with this third group of players, I'd like to have players who could fill in for injuries and players who could operate as specialists for my specific team's needs. At point guard, give me Gary Payton. With Magic Johnson and with Steph Curry, I don't really have the best defensive presence from the point guard position, but that will not be an issue when the glove is on the court, as he's likely the greatest defensive point guard in NBA history. Not only was Payton also a very capable scorer, but he was also one of the all-time great lob passers, and on this roster, he'll have plenty of weapons to utilize for his alley-oop connections. At shooting guard for the third unit, give me Jerry West. He was also one of the greatest defensive players ever at his position, and West had scoring capabilities that were beyond his time, including solid range from the perimeter. At small forward, give me Scottie Pippen, a dynamic slasher and alley-oop partner for Gary Payton and Magic Johnson, and he'll be an available lockdown perimeter defender whenever the team needs him. At power forward, I'll take Tim Duncan. He's smart, unselfish, and fundamentally sound. Duncan is also a player who is very comfortable playing alongside of another all-time great big, and in this case, beside him will be the ultimate winner. Rounded out with Bill Russell at the center position, and what you have here is the most suffocating and defensively soul-crushing third unit ever. All of these players are capable passers at their positions, and if any starter is struggling with their assignment for any reason, these substitutes will address that issue immediately and adequately. Now I know, some of you have noticed the triggering omission, as I left Wilt Chamberlain off the roster, which seems especially insane coming from me, since I'm usually one of the biggest advocates for Wilt's legacy and greatness. But the thing is, this roster is already extremely loaded with all-time great bigs, and chemistry is imperative for this roster to be the best that it can be. Because of this, I'd rather have the bigs who spent the prime of their careers in a more team-oriented offense. So that concludes my 15-man roster. I'm not gonna lie, I would love to see my starters take on the second unit, and even my third unit could serve as a challenger as well. Obviously, I do not believe my roster is objectively the greatest possible team imaginable, but it's just that in my opinion. Who knows, maybe in a week from now, I'll have a different opinion and change up my roster. But for now, this is what makes the most sense to me. If you have a roster that you believe is better constructed and can beat my team, please do share it in the comment section below. So NBA 2K just brought 5 different eras to their game, and nearly every era was named specifically after certain players. As in the case of many things, this got social media in a frenzy, as everyone began debating who the eras actually belonged to. According to 2K, there is the Magic and Bird era, the Jordan era, the Kobe era, the LeBron era, and the modern era. Well, considering the fact that I love basketball history and have a YouTube channel specifically dedicated to it, I figured I might as well give my perspective on them. Not only will I be saying whether or not I agree with 2K's choices, but I will also be giving titles to the earlier eras that 2K does not address. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first era that needs to be given a title was when the NBA was in its infancy, which is essentially the 1950s. For this one, there's basically no argument for anyone else. Without a shadow of a doubt, this was the George Mikan era. During this stretch of time, Mikan led his Lakers to win 4 championships in a span of 5 years, as the clear best player on his team. In that time, he also won several scoring titles and rebounding titles, as there was no question who the best player was in the game during that era. Next up is the 1960s. You guys know how much I love and respect Wilt Chamberlain on my channel, but let's be real, there's absolutely no argument for anyone other than Russell during this era, as I'm labeling the 1960s the Bill Russell era. In that decade, Russell led his team to win 9 out of a possible 10 championships, and the only other team who won a title was the 76ers, who were led by Chamberlain. You could argue that Russell and Chamberlain should have shared that era, just like Magic and Bird for the 80s, but the 9 championships to only 1 is just too big of a gap for me to make it make sense. I don't care if Chamberlain had averaged 70 points per game over that decade. It doesn't change the fact that the Celtics were the model of excellence in the 1960s, and it was Russell who won more chips than any other player in NBA history. Next, we're looking at the 1970s, and this is a bit of a tricky one. From an individual perspective, there's no question that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was the most talented and statistically dominant player over the course of that decade. But unfortunately, he only got 1 championship in that decade. And are we really about to name an entire era after a player who only reached the mountaintop once? In the 70s, the Celtics won more championships than anyone else, but that was just a grand total of 2, and the stardom of those teams was pretty evenly split between Dave Cowens and John Havlicek. If we're being honest, this era is famous for the fact that it didn't contain a single dynasty team, as there were many different winners over the course of the decade. For this reason, I would not title this era after a single player, but instead, I would call it the parity era, because it's the ultimate example of a balanced level of competition within the league. Next is the 1980s, and this won't take me very long because of course 2K got this one right, as this was definitely the Magic and Bird era. Between these two legendary superstars, they won 8 out of a possible 10 championships, and between the two of them, they represented every single NBA Finals series that decade. I imagine some die-hard Pistons fan might try to shoehorn Isaiah Thomas into the conversation, but he technically only won a single championship that decade, as the second one was the beginning of the 1990s. And as much as I respect Thomas's talent, he never won a single MVP award, unlike Magic and Bird, who won several. Without question, this is correctly named the Magic and Bird era. Now, the 1990s. Just like the decade before, this is an easy choice. This is appropriately named the Michael Jordan era. The Bulls won 6 out of a possible 10 championships that decade, and Jordan was the Finals MVP in every one of those cases. Along with that, MJ was pretty much universally recognized as the best player during that era, and anyone who disagreed just likely wanted to be different. Some might try to say that Hakeem should share the title of this era with MJ, but I think that's a little generous to the dream, considering how MJ has 3 times the amount of rings that Elijah has, and 4 times the amount of MVPs. I could unnecessarily go over his long list of accolades in that decade, but you guys get it. He was Michael Jordan, and that was his era. Now for the 2000s, and this is where things get really interesting. 2K decided to give the title exclusively to Kobe Bryant, and obviously, by them doing that, the biggest omission is the San Antonio Spurs legend, Tim Duncan. Imagine getting 5 championship rings as the leader of your team and not getting an era. Now, if you force me to pick one or the other, I do think there is a slightly better argument for Kobe Bryant than for Tim Duncan. The funny thing is that Duncan has consistency working in his favor, but that advantage quickly becomes a disadvantage when you limit the comparison to one specific era. Let's look at the 2000s. During this era, Kobe's Lakers won 4 championship rings, while Tim Duncan's Spurs won 3. The Lakers made it to the NBA Finals a total of 6 times, while the Spurs only made it 3 times. And when they met each other in the playoffs, Kobe's team eliminated the Spurs 4 times, and Duncan's team eliminated the Lakers only once. Unless you value regular season wins over actual championships, then there's no question that Kobe's team won significantly more during this era. Now, inevitably, many of my friends who are Spurs fans will then try to redirect Kobe's success exclusively towards Shaq, as if Kobe didn't earn any of that success. These are the numbers Kobe averaged in the playoffs against the Spurs while he was teammates with Shaq. And these are the numbers that Shaq put up in that same stretch against San Antonio. Many people have forgotten or just never realized that Kobe was arguably the best player on the court whenever they squared off with San Antonio. And heck, even in the one instance where Shaq wasn't involved, Kobe's Lakers still defeated the Spurs while he put up these strong numbers. So if I'm being forced to pick exclusively either Duncan or Kobe, then I'm going with Kobe. But my question is, why should I have to pick one or the other? Magic and Bird share the 1980s podium, yet when you look at the two head-to-head, it's clear that Magic won way more in that era than Bird did. So based on the precedent set by 2K, it should be the Kobe and Duncan era. It makes zero sense that Magic should have to share the era with Bird when Kobe doesn't have to share the era with Duncan. If the decision was ultimately up to me, I would disagree with 2K and would have made it the Kobe and Duncan era, regardless of the fact that Kobe may have had the slightly better case individually. Next is the 2010s, which 2K labeled the LeBron era, and this one is also spicy. Most people consider LeBron as the greatest player since the turn of the millennium, but when you narrow it down to one specific decade, I can see how Steph Curry fans were triggered by the dismissal. In the decade of the 2010s, LeBron won 3 NBA championships, and Steph Curry also won 3. LeBron made it all the way to the NBA Finals 8 times, and Steph made it to the Finals 5 times. When the two met up in the playoffs, LeBron's team eliminated Steph only once, while Curry's team eliminated LeBron a total of 3 times. Yes, I agree that LeBron was the best player over the course of that decade, but consider what Steph did in that window. He won back-to-back MVPs, becoming the first unanimous MVP in NBA history. He led his team to the best single-season record of all time, and led his team to the best single postseason record of all time as well. He broke numerous records, he had the greatest 50-40-90 season of all time, all while winning an equal amount of championships to LeBron. Not only does he deserve the respect, but he was legitimately a rival to LeBron James during that era. So again, if you're gonna have both Magic and Bird, then how are you just gonna pick LeBron in this instance? 2K really screwed this one up. And in case you can't tell, I completely disagree with them, as I would have titled it as the LeBron and Steph era. The last era on the list is simply described by 2K as the modern era, and honestly, I think that's the correct call. A lot of players in the modern game are still early in their careers, and if 2K hypothetically called this, say, the Nikola Jokic era, and then Giannis went on to win 2 or 3 more championship rings, then that would age incredibly poorly. As of now, keep a player's name off of it, and let the players write the history for themselves. So what do you guys think? Did NBA 2K get the eras right? Or is there something that you would have changed if the decision was ultimately up to you? I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments section below. Thanks. Well, this is a first. Today I uploaded a video about the 6 dirtiest players in NBA history, and YouTube actually deemed the video as unfit for non-adults, and instantly made the video age restricted. Because of this, I basically make no money off of the video, and much of my audience doesn't have access to it. Well, seeing that YouTube apparently wants my videos to have the intensity of a Bob the Builder episode, I decided to chug 3 soy lattes and completely neuter the video with childish edits, and then re-upload the video with no sarcastic or passive-aggressive edits towards YouTube whatsoever. If you'd rather watch the heavy metal, rebellious, criminal version, that is still available on the channel for those above the age of 18. For the rest of you, this will have to do. Most days on my channel, I like to highlight the strengths and positive aspects about various NBA players, but today is not one of those days. On this day, we're taking a look at the 6 dirtiest players in the history of the league. Now first, let me explain. In no way do I believe that my list is an objectively correct list, but it's simply my opinion based on my experience while watching these players. There's several factors that went into my ranking, like how often the players committed dirty plays, how egregious were the offenses, and how long were they doing it throughout their careers. There's so many players who could have been on this list but didn't make it. So let me know in the comments if there's a player I left off that you would put into your top 6. So without further ado, let's get into it. Number 6. Zaza Pachulia. This 6'11 center had a 16-year career, and he was never an all-star, and most people would describe him as average at best. But to many people, he'll be remembered for a long time for all the wrong reasons. In many instances, Zaza looked as if he was trying to outright hurt people, and if I'm being honest, he hasn't always been the best at hiding it. The most memorable moment of his career was when he slid his foot under a jump-shooting Kawhi Leonard in Game 1 of the 2017 Western Conference Finals. At that point, the Spurs were leading the game by 19 points, and appeared as if they were about to steal home court advantage in the series. Instead, Kawhi was lost for the series, and the Spurs were swept. This unnatural defensive play may have had a history-changing ripple effect on the NBA as a whole. But trust me when I say this, that play was far from the only instance of Zaza playing with questionable motives, and based on the fact that his legacy is alive today because of his dirty antics, he gets the starting spot on my list. Number 5. Draymond Green. I can already hear the screeching 14-year-old Warriors fans in the chat, because I just picked 2 straight players from Golden State. But to be fair, Zaza only spent 2 of his 16 seasons with the Warriors, so most of his dirty plays were with other teams. Back to Draymond though, it kinda blows my mind how many Warriors fans continue to defend Draymond, as if he's some kind of saint. My thought process is there's only so many times a player can be the center of an altercation before we start to label him a dirty player, and for me personally, I came to that conclusion a long time ago. Some players have very specific dirty antics, and we'll get into that in a bit. But as for Draymond, he executes his dirty maneuvers in a variety of ways, like stomping on players' chests, like kicking them in the junk, slapping them in the junk, and slapping them in the face. Although he's certainly one of the greatest defensive players to ever live, Green usually never passes up an opportunity to dish out some punishment, just vaguely enough for it to look like it was an accident to some. If you ask me, Green is one of the more subtle, dirty players in NBA history, but based on the insane number of frequent offenses, I think he definitely deserves a spot on this list. Number 4. Meta World Peace, formerly known as Ron Artest. He wasn't the most frequent offender, and although he played physically, he likely had the fewest dirty plays out of any player in my top 6. But with that being said, World Peace committed some of the most egregious dirtiness that the game of basketball has ever seen. Obviously, he was the player who famously triggered the malice at the palace when he ran into the stands to punch some fans who admittedly deserved to get. Artest was involved in several altercations that night, but in hindsight, maybe the most shocking dirty play was when he absolutely wrecked James Harden's temple with an utterly elbow. This instance was especially ridiculous because at this point, he now had the words "World Peace" written across his back. Like Draymond, he was also an all-time great defensive player, but as in the case of many of those intense, energetic types, they tend to take things a step too far every once in a while, and Artest was no exception. Number 3. Karl Malone. Remember in Draymond Green's segment when I said there were players with more specific types of dirty? Well, there's no better example of that than Karl Malone, who was constantly throwing around some of the most and elbows that I've ever seen. On a side note, imagine being a player who was throwing around elbows throughout the entirety of your career and is also the player with the most technical fouls in NBA history, yet neither of those things are the most negative thing you're remembered for. Regardless of his basketball skills, that is the legacy of Karl Malone. As I was saying about his elbows, they were insanely and it didn't help matters that he was one of the strongest and most powerful players of all time. In several cases, he even knocked out the opposing player. One of those players was Elliot Perry, who didn't play in the final 38 minutes of that game due to the KO blow. Another player was the Hall of Fame center David Robinson, who went so limp that it almost looked like he was going to break his leg from the fall. Robinson is also one of the strongest players in the history of the game, and the mailman dropped him in an instant with one of the most devastating cheap shots that you'll ever see. The most famous incident though was when Malone dealt this punishing blow to Isaiah Thomas in the first quarter of a regular season game. Isaiah described the contact by saying that it felt like he had just been shot in the head. Amazingly, Isaiah actually returned to the game in the fourth quarter. At the end of the day, these were just a few crazy examples of his most punishing signature move in the NBA. And considering how much he loved to dish out these elbows, it's no wonder why he tried his luck in the WWE. Number 2. Bruce Bowen. It takes a lot of dirtiness to be ranked ahead of the mailman, but Bowen earned his spot with his devious schemes. Although he was the Defensive Player of the Year runner-up for 3 straight seasons, I'm not gonna lie, I'm glad he never won the award because of his antics on the court, including his flying Bruce Lee Bowen kick to Wally Zerbiak's face. Also when he unnecessarily stepped on Kobe's wrist in the playoffs, and him repeatedly sliding under the foot of the jump shooter as he was landing. Seriously, go back and watch some Bruce Bowen footage, and you'll see that this maneuver of his was about as consistent as the fadeaway was for Michael Jordan. No player knows that better than Vince Carter, who had his ankle rolled a total of 3 times by the Spurs defender, and on the third instance, you could tell things had reached a boiling point with Carter. But make no mistake, he tried this cheap tactic with many other stars, including Kobe Bryant, Michael Finley, and Paul Pierce. The funny thing is, Bowen has an argument for the top spot, but unlike the guy in first, Bowen isn't a bold kind of dirty. But he's rather quiet about it, and still says to this day that he's never tried to intentionally hurt anyone. The film seems to strongly suggest otherwise, and for this reason, he securely takes the runner-up spot on my list. Number 1. Bill Laimbeer. This man is the face of what is likely the dirtiest team in the history of the NBA, the bad boy Detroit Pistons. Laimbeer's reputation was so awful within the NBA that he even had nicknames like the Prince of Darkness, His Heinous, and Axe. A bit of a dramatic reputation for simply a basketball player, but unlike Bruce Bowen, Laimbeer reveled in it, and loved knowing that he was hated by pretty much the entirety of the basketball community outside of Detroit. In the words of Larry Bird, Rick Mahorn would try to foul you hard, but his teammate Bill Laimbeer would try to hurt you. There's no one more suited to give that opinion than Bird, as it appeared that Laimbeer tried to hurt him on multiple occasions. As someone who's seen many of the games he was involved in, I can tell you that his punishing cheap shots was a very regular occurrence. Eventually, someone finally decided to return the favor, as the Celtics center Robert Parrish struck Lambier across the face. The crazy thing about this play is that they didn't even call a flagrant foul, a technical foul, or a foul of any kind on Parrish. The ref simply stopped the action and resumed play as soon as Lambier had gathered himself, which seemed indicative of how the league felt about Lambier at the time. He might not have the ugliest acts of violence on his resume, but based on how frequently Lambier was punishing other players, I'm very comfortable putting him in the top spot on this list of notorious players. So what do you guys think? Who was a candidate for the dirtiest player that wasn't on my list? This has kind of been a roundabout theme for my channel for the last week or so I thought I might as well just own it and cover it. Who are the top 5 greatest shot blocking guards in NBA history? I have a couple categories for deciding this, like their peak shot blocking, their shot contention, their consistency, and their longevity. It's a very specific category, and it only applies to guys who spent the majority of the time either at the point guard or at the shooting guard position. So guys like George Gervin, Vince Carter, and Tracy McGrady won't be applicable to this list, as great as they were as shot blockers. They are guys who spent a significant amount of time at the small forward position. So although you could argue that they're among the best shot blocking wings in NBA history, I just can't give them the nod for guards. So now that you're up to speed, let's get into it. Starting at number 5, Dennis Johnson. This guy was simply one of the best perimeter defenders of his era. Longtime Boston Celtics fans are going to remember him as the leading floor general of their dynasty days. But beyond that, he was an incredible shot blocker. DJ is 5th on the NBA's all-time list for the most blocked shots at the guard position, and he had a career average of 0.6 throughout his playing career. Throughout the 1980s, Boston was consistently one of the best defenses in the entire league. And Johnson's ability to stay in front of top opposing guards and get a hand up and sometimes get a piece of it certainly contributed in massive ways to their elite defense. Thanks to his longevity and consistency, he certainly deserves a spot in my mind. Number 4 on my list is Derek White. Some of you are probably thinking, Derek White? Yes, actually. The guy has been absolutely incredible ever since he entered the NBA in 2017. He's been one of the top defenders for his championship Boston Celtics, and so far in his career, he's averaging 0.9 blocks per game. Currently, among guards, specifically at the time where they were playing at the guard position, Derek White has the second highest blocks per game average in NBA history, which is 0.9, and this last season, he got as high as 1.2. He is extremely alert, aggressive, has good instincts, and has a good basketball IQ. He's certainly not a superstar, but he knows his role and he does it well. If he remains consistent and keeps up at this pace, by the end of his career, he could be in a top 2 spot. Number 3, Ron Harper. Ron Harper doesn't get as much shine as he deserves overall for his defensive abilities. Obviously, he was the point guard and was a major piece of the Bulls' second three-peat in the 1990s. But before that, he had tremendous athleticism and was a star player for both the Los Angeles Clippers and the Cleveland Cavaliers. It might seem hard to believe for some, but among guards, he has the 3rd highest blocks total in NBA history, as he averaged 0.7 over the course of his career, getting as high as 1.2 in 1990. Unfortunately, you're going to be hard-pressed to find a tremendous amount of film of him blocking shots. And I promise you, that's not because he wasn't good at it, that's simply because he's Ron Harper, and not many people are clamoring to save his highlights. With that being said, I remember him being fantastic, even when he was with the Lakers in limited minutes at the age of 36 and 37. Again, he's another guy on this list who gains a lot of points for both consistency and longevity. Number 2, Dwayne Wade. Flash was incredible as a shot blocker. He did it emphatically and athletically. Depending on how you look at it based in position, he's either in the first spot or the second spot for the most blocked shots among guards in NBA history, as he averaged 0.8 over the course of his career. Wade was extremely aggressive, but obviously, with a nickname like Flash, it was his quickness and speed, along with his ability to read the offense, that helped him get exactly where he needed to be to contest many shots and get plenty of swats. He got as high as 1.3 blocks per game in 2009, where he was also an MVP candidate. I think many people will assume that he should be in the number 1 spot. But at the very least, I think the vast majority of us can agree that he certainly deserves to be in the top 2. Number 1, Michael Jordan. If you look at the time that he specifically spent at the shooting guard position, then he has the highest blocks per game average of all time among guards. He got as high as 1.6 in 1988, which was the year that he famously won the MVP and the Defensive Player of the Year in the same season. For obvious reasons, I've been watching a ton of Michael Jordan footage over the last week, and I'm telling you, a young MJ was the best shot blocker I've ever seen among guards. Part of that is for his actual swats, but the other part is just because of how many he actually contested. MJ went for everything. He was swiping constantly, to the point that I'm sure some offensive players going against him were having anxiety attacks. His peak as a shot blocker was just so insane, and he didn't have the consistency as much as some of these other guys, but when you're looking at a young MJ who was scrawny, who was quick, and who could jump out of the gym, he had this ability to a jaw-dropping extent that I haven't seen from really anyone else. Here is my long list of honorable mentions. There's certainly a lot of guys in this list who deserve some spotlight as well. Do you think any of these players should have made the top 5 instead? So at the time I'm making this video, we're in the midst of an NBA offseason, and there's been some exciting developments that have been building anticipation for the upcoming season. So this got me wondering, what were the most exciting NBA off-seasons that I can remember? Today, I put together a short list, and I'll do my best to explain why these developments were so exciting at the time they happened. Also, let me know in the comments what were some of the most exciting off-seasons to you. So without further ado, let's get into it. First off, the 2009 off-season. At the very end of the 2000s, the NBA had finally reached a point where the Western Conference and the Eastern Conference were both extremely competitive simultaneously. The Lakers had just defeated the Orlando Magic in the 2009 NBA Finals, and although the Magic were still a quality team, the Boston Celtics were the Eastern Conference favorites before Kevin Garnett's season-ending knee injury. LeBron James and the Cleveland Cavaliers also seemed as if they were on the verge of making it to the NBA Finals soon, and they were coming off of a 66-16 season that ended in disappointment at the hands of Dwight Howard and the Orlando Magic. The general feeling and consensus around the league was that most elite teams seemed like they were in a position to win a championship as long as they made one significant move in the offseason. And guess what? Just about every serious contender did just that. First off, on June 23rd, the seemingly always contending San Antonio Spurs made a major splash when they traded the aging Bruce Bowen for a 29-year-old Richard Jefferson. The Spurs viewed this acquisition as the move they needed, as San Antonio was looking for an offensive spark, and now they were bringing in a quality slasher who was averaging around 20 points per game. Now they were looking more threatening to the defending champion Lakers out west. 2 days later, the Orlando Magic made their own major move, as they traded for a 32-year-old Vince Carter, who was coming off of a season with the Nets where he had just averaged 21 points per game. Although Orlando had the number 1 ranked defense in the previous season, their most common critique was that they needed more offensive support for Dwight Howard. And now, with Carter on the roster, they had just addressed that in a major way. The very next day, the Cavaliers responded with their own move to position themselves to be the best in the Eastern Conference, when they traded for a veteran Shaquille O'Neal, who was coming off of a productive season with the Phoenix Suns, where he averaged nearly 18 points and 8 rebounds on a league-best 60.9% shooting. It was not a prime Shaq, but many people still viewed this acquisition as the help that LeBron needed in order to return to the finals. Then, on July 8th, the two most recent NBA champions responded with their own significant upgrades. The defending champion Lakers added the intimidating Ron Artest, who had just averaged 17 points and was still an elite defender in the game. He had also just led his Houston Rockets to the semifinals, where he famously pushed Kobe's Lakers to 7 games. And after their intense playoff exchange, people were wondering how Kobe and Artest would get along as teammates. The Celtics responded by adding the 6'10 big man Rasheed Wallace, who brought even more championship experience and was a solid spark both offensively and defensively. Basically every serious contender had made their moves, setting up the 09-10 season to be an absolute bloodbath. Honestly, at that point, I think that was the most excited I've ever been to be a basketball fan. Next up, the 2003 offseason. Obviously, there was that all-time great draft, where LeBron was taken first by the Cavs, Darko Milicic was taken second by the Pistons, and Carmelo Anthony was taken third by the Denver Nuggets. After that, Chris Bosh went fourth to the Toronto Raptors, and Dwayne Wade went fifth to the Miami Heat. At the time, Bosh and Wade were seen more as wild cards, but in terms of LeBron James and Carmelo Anthony, we knew that they were on their way to being all-time greats. And I was in so much anticipation to see them compete against the other elite wings of that era, like Kobe Bryant, Tracy McGrady, and Vince Carter. On that day, Detroit was enthusiastic about their newly acquired big man, but in the long run, he didn't make much of a difference for them. Obviously, Kobe Bryant's Colorado trial was not fun for anyone, but in terms of the pure basketball, Los Angeles was building up quite the excitement, as they created a super team by adding Gary Payton and Karl Malone, who were each coming off of seasons where they averaged 20 points per game as the best player on their squads. Many analysts were predicting this group to challenge the Bulls' 72-10 record. The San Antonio Spurs were the defending NBA champions, and were the team who had just eliminated the Lakers in the prior postseason, and put an end to their three-peat. They responded to the Lakers' acquisitions of Payton and Malone by snagging up the 5-time NBA champion Robert Horry, who was previously seen as a hero in Los Angeles. Not only was this a brilliant move by San Antonio for the sake of his clutch perimeter shooting, but it also seemed like it was a way to emotionally stick it to the Lakers after they just built a super team. Unlike 2009, the anticipation of the 2003 offseason had less to do with the X's and O's of the basketball, and more to do with all of the drama between the various players and organizations. Lastly, my third choice for an insanely exciting off-season was 1996. I gotta be honest, I was very young at this point, so the memory of experiencing it is a bit hazy. But even with just my explanation of the events, it's not hard to understand why the basketball world was so intrigued by how things were unfolding. First off, the Chicago Bulls were coming off of their record-breaking 72-10 championship run, and they started their title defense off right by extending the contracts of Michael Jordan, Dennis Rodman, and Phil Jackson. On the other hand, almost everyone else was trying to build a team capable of dethroning the juggernaut in Chicago. The New York Knicks started by signing the lethal shooter Allen Houston to a massive long-term contract. Then, New York traded Anthony Mason to the Charlotte Hornets for a prime Larry Johnson, who had just averaged over 20 points and 8 rebounds. This team on paper looked absolutely stacked, with proven all-stars like Patrick Ewing, John Starks, Charles Oakley, Allen Houston, and Larry Johnson. They appeared as if they were the deepest team in the league, and at the time, many New Yorkers believed that this was the team that could finally defeat the Chicago Bulls. The Atlanta Hawks were already a talented team, but that offseason, they made waves when they signed the 30-year-old Dikembe Mutombo, who was a recent Defensive Player of the Year winner. Now that stacked Atlanta team was setting things up to be even tougher for the Bulls in the Eastern Conference. Out west, several teams were trying to build juggernauts of their own, starting with the San Antonio Spurs. In the previous season, David Robinson, Sean Elliott, and a talented Spurs group had won 59 regular season games. And in the offseason, they added to that immense talent by signing a veteran, Dominique Wilkins, who was still a near 20 points per game scorer in his late 30s. Over in Houston, Hakeem Olajuwon and the Rockets were looking to return to their recent championship status. So in a stunning move, they made a blockbuster offseason trade, as they added a 32-year-old Charles Barkley to the mix, who was still putting up superstar numbers at that point in his career. With a starting lineup that included Hakeem Olajuwon, Clyde Drexler, and Charles Barkley, Houston had created a terrifying super team that seemed bound to meet the Chicago Bulls in the NBA Finals. The Lakers did not have a super team, but they still made the biggest splash of that offseason by luring Shaquille O'Neal away from the Orlando Magic and signing him to a massive contract. On top of that, there was the NBA draft, where the Lakers traded for a young kid straight out of high school, Kobe Bryant. Sure, we had no idea just how good this kid would become, but even then, there was still much excitement in Los Angeles for Kobe. Even outside of Bryant, the '96 draft was one of the most hyped and highly anticipated drafts of all time. Obviously, over time, we realized that that initial excitement was well-deserved, as this became arguably the greatest draft class in the history of the NBA. The NBA has a deep and rich history that includes many exciting events, but as much time as I spend talking and thinking about these classic moments of basketball history, I probably spend an equal amount of time thinking about the moments and situations that I wish could have turned out differently. In this video, I'm sharing the top 4 things in NBA history that I personally would change if it was in my control. For the sake of keeping this a fun and contemplative video, I will not be including any situations that involve a tragedy, since those would make the easiest and obvious choices. So without further ado, let's get into it. Number 4. A Kobe vs. LeBron finals matchup in 2009. This appeared to be on a collision course throughout the majority of the year, as the Cavaliers and the Lakers each had the best record in their respective conferences. Once Kevin Garnett went down with a knee injury that would force him to miss the playoffs, and with the defending champion Boston Celtics basically out of the picture, a Cavs and Lakers finals seemed as if it was a foregone conclusion. Not only was it the expectation, but the basketball community as a whole seemed to be actively rooting for it, as both players were all over the commercials, both players led their position in All-Star voting, and both players led the NBA's MVP race. One man represented the state of the NBA as it was, while the other was clearly the league's future. No example is greater than the NBA is not completely scripted than this one, because if it was, these two teams would have absolutely met in the NBA Finals. Unfortunately, the Orlando Magic were clicking at just the right time, and despite an iconic game-winning shot from LeBron James, they ultimately came up short against the Magic in the East Finals, losing to them in 6 games. At the time, I was actually happy that my Lakers only had to face the Magic and not the Cavaliers, because I felt less intimidated by Orlando, and I knew we could make quick work of them, which was exactly what we did, defeating them in only 5 games. But now, all these years later, considering how Kobe and LeBron never met in the finals, I strongly wish it would have been Cleveland after all, as it would have made for one of the most exciting championship series of NBA history. It truly is a sadly missed opportunity, considering how it was so close to happening for quite some time, as either Kobe or LeBron were in the NBA Finals every year from 2007 all the way to 2018. Number 3. Michael Jordan doesn't play for the Wizards in 2002 and 2003, but for another team instead. Michael Jordan's competitive drive and his connection to the Washington organization led him to suit up and play for the Washington Wizards for his final 2 seasons. If you followed this channel for very long, then you've heard me go on and on about how underappreciated Jordan's years were with the Washington Wizards, as he turned the Wizards into legit competitors in the Eastern Conference leading up to his meniscus tear, and Jordan was among the hottest players in the league at that point as well. If it wasn't for a freak accident where Jordan and Eton Thomas collided, then MJ could have taken his Wizards into the East playoffs, where they may have made some noise. The thing is, Jordan stepped down from his general manager position with the Wizards in order to play with the team for 2 seasons. Jordan had assumed that when he had finished his tenure as a Wizards player, he would resume his position as the Wizards general manager. The Wizards owner, Abe Pollin, had something else in mind and fired Jordan from the team soon after he finished playing. This hurt Jordan on a personal level, and he said that he felt betrayed by the owner. Jordan later stated that he wouldn't have ever played for the Wizards if he had knew the true status of his relationship with the Wizards owner. So let's hypothetically say that Jordan had knew this. His itch to return to play basketball was almost certainly going to be acted upon regardless. So if he isn't playing for the Wizards, who would he have played for? He's definitely not going back to the Chicago Bulls, as they were not only terrible at that point, but they were also still being managed by Jerry Krause, who famously wasn't near the top of Jordan's buddy list. There's two destinations that I think Jordan could have gone to instead. One is the Los Angeles Lakers, where he would have played under Phil Jackson once again, and where he would have taken a mentorship role for Kobe Bryant. The other option is for the Portland Trail Blazers, where he would have played alongside of his former longtime teammate Scottie Pippen. Both of these Western Conference teams were among the NBA's championship contenders. So what do you guys think I'm going to say? Of course, I wish he would have played for the Los Angeles Lakers, as he would have taken the starting small forward position ahead of the Lakers' Rick Fox. I wish this would have happened instead of his time with the Wizards, as it would have made the most star-studded trio of NBA history, while giving Jordan another opportunity to compete for a couple more championships in the final seasons of his career. Not to mention how interesting it would have been to see Jordan and Kobe have to get along on the same roster. Number 2. I would wipe the Malice at the Palace out of NBA history. If this single event doesn't take place, or if that drink had just barely missed Ron Artest, it would have changed so many things throughout NBA history. The Indiana Pacers were arguably the championship favorites at the time the brawl took place. But with Ron Artest being suspended for the rest of the season, and with Jermaine O'Neal and Steven Jackson missing a significant amount of time as well, their season was basically ruined on the spot. The most devastating part of that was how that season was the last of Reggie Miller's career, which could have sent him out with his one and only NBA championship ring. As much as that sucks, Miller and the Pacers are just small-scale aspects of how the league was affected. The NBA as a whole became super paranoid about situations escalating into violence, and David Stern said that he would do everything in his power to make sure that the league would never have an evening like that ever again. It had an extremely softening effect on the league, as for one, referees became much quicker to call technical fouls, and became incredibly quick to punish any players for excessive trash talking. The Malice at the Palace also resulted in the NBA creating new rules to discourage any potential brawls. This might not sound like a negative thing, but we do have a direct example of how it negatively impacted the outcome of an NBA season. One of the new rules stated that during an altercation, all players not participating in the game must remain in the immediate vicinity of their bench. Violators will be suspended without pay for a minimum of 1 game and be fined up to $50,000. To the embarrassment of the league, this rule took effect for Game 5 of the 2007 Western Conference semifinals between the San Antonio Spurs and the Phoenix Suns. Towards the end of Game 4, Robert Horry famously hip-checked Steve Nash into the scorer's table, which naturally resulted in the Phoenix players reacting. Suns star Amari Stoudemire and quality role player Boris Diaw both barely left the bench area before they were quickly rushed back by their coaching staff. As insignificant as this may have seemed, the NBA went through with their Malice at the Palace rule and suspended both Stoudemire and Diaw from Game 5, which was a crucial 5th game in Phoenix. The Suns went on to not only lose that game, but they lost home court advantage and eventually lost the series as a result. The Malice at the Palace not only significantly softened the NBA, but it possibly cost Steve Nash's Suns and Reggie Miller's Pacers an NBA championship. All of this is why I would definitely change that horrible night in Detroit. Number 1. The NBA doesn't veto the Chris Paul trade to the Lakers. Now obviously, there is probably some subconscious bias toward this situation, since I've always been a huge Lakers fan. But even outside of the Lakers, this blocked trade had a massive negative effect on the basketball world. If the trade is never blocked, Chris Paul may actually be an NBA champion. Kobe and LeBron would have likely had their long-desired matchups in the NBA Finals. Kobe likely never tears his Achilles since he wouldn't have been playing those absurd amount of minutes just to get his team into the playoffs, and Kobe Bryant and Tim Duncan would have had more matchups in the West playoffs and likely would have added much more history to their famous rivalry. The biggest part that bothers me about this block trade is how it affected the perceived integrity of the league. Dell Demps was the general manager of the Hornets at that time, and when he tried to trade Chris Paul to the Lakers, he was doing it out of the best interest of his team. But because the Hornets organization didn't have an official team owner, David Stern was able to flex his power and stop the trade for reasons that had nothing to do with the Hornets' best interest. You see, at this point in basketball history, the Miami Heat's Big Three had just assembled, and other small market teams were becoming fearful of a league being completely run by super teams. So when Chris Paul had appeared to join forces with Kobe, team owners like Mark Cuban and Dan Gilbert famously complained to David Stern, asking him to stop the trade. So that's exactly what David Stern proceeded to do. Listen, as an old school basketball fan, I don't really like super teams, and I'm all for the league office taking steps to assure that there's a competitive and fair balance. But if they're gonna do that, they should do that in the off-season, when no trades or free agency moves are taking place. Implement rules and procedures that encourage players to avoid making super teams. Everything the Hornets, Rockets, and Lakers did in this three-team trade was legal and was within the best intent of their organizations, and the league completely disrupted that just as the trade was being executed. Yes, I didn't like it when Kevin Durant joined the 73-9 Warriors during the prime of his career, but as much as I didn't respect that move from a competitive standpoint, I respected his freedom to make that decision for himself, because it was legal and honored the rules of the league. Even if the league had the power to do so, I wouldn't have wanted them to block that signing, since Kevin and the Warriors didn't break any rules, and it would have affected the course of basketball history as a result. That's exactly what happened with the Chris Paul trade, and I think the ways it affected the league overall were significantly more negative than positive, especially when you consider how it accomplished absolutely nothing in preventing the era of super teams. Throughout the years, there have been a lot of players who have been great at stealing the basketball, whether it be jumping the passing lanes, reaching into the cookie jar, or coming in and trapping guys as the help defender. The thing is, a lot of guys get highlighted and remembered for these attributes, but because it isn't an ability that's as romanticized as scoring, rebounding, or passing, some of the greatest ever to do it have been overlooked and have been forgotten in the long history of this league. Today, we're looking at the top 10 pickpockets in NBA history, and let me know in the comments how your list would differ from mine. Starting with number 10, Gary Payton. The Glove was simply one of the greatest defensive guards of all time, and he was an especially great pickpocket, as he got as high as 2.9 steals per game in the 95-96 season, which was also the year that he won the Defensive Player of the Year. He did have longevity on his side, as he ended up being 5th all-time in total steals, but he didn't necessarily have the most gaudy steals numbers on a year-to-year basis, as he has the 25th highest career average of all time. Regardless, longtime basketball fans know all about this guy, as he was one of the most smothering and frustrating players who would let you hear about it along the way. On my list, his resume is just good enough to crack the top 10. Number 9, Hakeem Olajuwon. Some people might be surprised to see Hakeem on this list, and I get it, he's a center. But for myself personally, that's part of what contributes to his case and gives him some extra points. Centers are not usually guarding the primary ball handlers and ball distributors. Therefore, it's generally more difficult for them to acquire a higher number of steals. But with Hakeem's quickness, with his defensive IQ, and with his incredibly long wingspan, he was able to make it happen and was usually among the league leaders in steals, not just for his position, but overall. He has the highest career steals per game average for a center in NBA history at 1.7, and second place isn't all that close. He got as high as 2.6 in 1989. He has the 35th highest career average of all time, and on the all-time list of total steals, he is in a top 10 spot. Again, being a pickpocket who averaged a career 1.7 steals is impressive, but to do it as an incredible rim-protecting 7-foot center is utterly insane. If you ask me, and when you take in the context of their position, Hakeem definitely deserves a spot on this list. Number 8. Maurice Cheeks. Mo Cheeks wouldn't put up the most ridiculous numbers on a game-to-game basis, but he was an all-star level player and a great defensive player as well, who was very consistent and who did his job well night in and night out. He got as high as 2.6 steals per game in 1982 and in 1987. He never once led the NBA in steals per game, but as I mentioned before, that consistency led him to have an amazing career, as he has the 6th most total steals in NBA history, and the 9th highest career average. Number 7. Jason Kidd. As I mentioned on the last placement, Mo Cheeks was consistent, but even more consistent than him was Jason Kidd, who also never once led the NBA in steals per game. In his near 20-year NBA career, he never once averaged more than 2.3 steals per game, but he also never got below 1.5. He has the 18th highest steals per game average for a career, but he's second all-time in total steals. Kidd was one of the more underrated defensive players of his era, and although he wasn't the most athletically gifted, he made up for it with his incredible intelligence and defensive IQ. Number 6. Mookie Blaylock. His nickname was simply The Thief, thanks to his elite pickpocket skills. That fact alone basically secured his spot in the top 10. If we're being honest, he's probably one of the most underappreciated defensive guards in NBA history. He led the NBA in steals per game twice, getting as high as 2.7 in 1997. For his career, he has the 4th highest steals per game average in NBA history, and he's 13th overall in total steals. He's a guy that most young modern fans are not going to be familiar with, but make no mistake, defensively, he was one of the most troublesome and turnover-creating guards of his era. Number 5. Chris Paul. As a pickpocket, a prime CP3 was an absolute menace, especially during his days as a Hornet. He led the NBA in steals per game a whopping 6 times, getting as high as 2.8 in 2009. He has the 10th highest career average in NBA history, and currently he's 3rd all-time in total steals. He's still an active player in the NBA, so he still has time to add to this resume and potentially climb this list. With that being said, a top 5 spot is nothing to scoff at. Number 4. Michael Jordan. With MJ's quickness and with his massive hands, he was an absolute hound and a pest on defense. MJ was certainly aggressive, and although he was great as an on-ball defender, he also took a lot of risks in the passing lanes, and that translated to some truly impressive steals numbers. He led the NBA in steals 3 times in his career, and specifically between 1987 and 1993, Jordan averaged an absurd 2.8 steals per game. He is 4th all-time in total steals, and he has the 3rd highest steals per game average in NBA history. Just one of the many top 10 lists that Jordan cracks. Number 3. John Stockton. He was an extremely aggressive and physical player who knew how to get up into the bodies of the offensive player and frustrate them tremendously. He led the league in steals per game twice in his long NBA career, and he is 1st all-time in total steals. Although he didn't have the most explosive and gaudy steals numbers, what John Stockton had was consistency, which is why he's in the number 1 spot. He had the 7th highest steals per game average in NBA history. Overall, I don't think Stockton gets enough love and appreciation for what he did defensively, as he was a stabilizing force for Utah on that end for essentially 2 decades. Number 2. Michael Ray Richardson. This ranking might surprise some of you, considering that he's generally an unknown player. He's also only 57th on the all-time list for total steals. But to be completely honest, that was due to his extremely shortened NBA career. Essentially what you need to know is this guy violated the league's drug policy 3 times, and in February of 1986, David Stern banned him from the NBA for life. He was only 30 years old at the time that he was banned. His peak was absolutely insane though, as he led the league in steals 3 times in his career, getting as high as 3.2 in 1980. For his 8-season-long career, he had a jaw-dropping average of 2.6 steals, which is the second highest career average of all time. That is an average that many players don't ever reach for a single season, and that's what he got over that 8-year stretch. Truly one of the great forgotten defensive legends of his time. Here is my list of honorable mentions. Should any of these pickpockets have made the top 10 instead? I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Number 1, Alvin Robertson. Like Michael Ray Richardson before him, Alvin Robertson didn't have a very lengthy NBA career, which is why he's only 11th all time for the most total steals. With that being said, he did lead the NBA in steals per game 3 times, getting as high as a ridiculous 3.7 in 1986. That is easily the NBA record for the highest single season average of all time. He averaged at least 3 steals per game in 5 separate seasons of his career, which is utterly insane. Most of the players on this top 10 list never got close to averaging 3 steals per game even once in their career. He has the greatest career steals per game average of all time, at an astonishing 2.7. Only 4 players in NBA history have ever achieved the illustrious quadruple-double. And thanks to Robertson's all-time great pickpocket skills, he became the first and only guard to ever do it, which he did on February 18, 1986 against the Phoenix Suns. The thing is, that was just 1 out of 4 games where Alvin Robertson got 10 steals. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, he is the greatest pickpocket that the league has ever seen. So what do you guys think? How would your list differ from mine? Let me know below. The NBA has 2 major conferences, the Western Conference and the Eastern Conference, and for as long as the NBA has been a thing, the winner of each conference are the teams who play in the NBA Finals. The thing is, that doesn't necessarily mean that the 2 best teams in the league are being represented in the NBA Finals, because decently often, the 2 best teams in the league are actually within the same conference. Today, we're looking at 4 instances where the 2 best teams were clearly battling in the conference finals rather than the NBA Finals. Let's get into it. First off, the 1971 West Finals. The winner of the East Conference was about as improbable of a winner as they come. Although the Baltimore Bullets had quality star players like Wes Unseld and Earl Monroe, they were a pretty average team throughout the regular season, both offensively and defensively, which is why they barely snuck into the playoffs with a 42-40 record. Somehow, they played far above their expectations when the playoffs began, as they won every series in 7 games up until the NBA Finals. Meanwhile, in the Western Conference, 2 championship-caliber teams were battling it out for a trip to the game's biggest stage. It was the Los Angeles Lakers, led by Wilt Chamberlain and Gil Goodrich, up against the dynamic duo of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Oscar Robertson of the Milwaukee Bucks. Headlining the matchup was a battle of 2 of the greatest centers of all time, as both Kareem and Wilt had fantastic showings throughout the series. Ultimately, Kareem and the Bucks were just too much for the Lakers, as they closed them out in 5 games. Although that wasn't the longest series, there was still little doubt that both of those teams would have easily handled the Bullets, who were in way over their heads being in the finals in the first place. As expected, Kareem and the Bucks destroyed the overachieving Bullets, sweeping them in 4 games and winning nearly every game by a double-digit margin. Next is the 2002 West Finals. I gotta be honest, I think out of every series on this list, this one was the most obvious that the championship winner was coming from the Western Conference Finals. The New Jersey Nets were a solid team, but at this point in history, it was widely recognized that the Western Conference as a whole was far superior to the East. The Western Conference Finals were a matchup between the Sacramento Kings and the defending champion Los Angeles Lakers. At the time, these two teams had a fierce rivalry, and throughout the regular season, it was basically a foregone conclusion amongst basketball circles that these two teams would meet up in the West Finals. The Kings had won 61 games throughout the regular season, and the Lakers had won 58 as a third seed. Meanwhile, the New Jersey Nets won only 52 games throughout the regular season, yet they had the best record in the entire Eastern Conference by a couple of games. That should tell you all you need to know about the disparity between the East and the West during that era. The Lakers and Kings series was an absolute classic, but it was also a series mired with controversy. At the end of the day, the Lakers won the series in overtime of the 7th game, and we all knew what would happen next. In the finals, the Lakers took their victory lap by sweeping the New Jersey Nets in 4 games, confirming what we all basically knew before the playoffs even started. Next up, the 2009 West Finals. That season, the winner of the Eastern Conference was the Dwight Howard-led Orlando Magic. And although they were a solid team, their road to the finals was a bit easier than it should have been, considering how the defending champion Boston Celtics lost their superstar Kevin Garnett to a knee injury before the playoffs began. If it wasn't for the injury, everyone would have expected a finals rematch between the Lakers and the Celtics in the finals. Now, the Western Conference Finals was a matchup between the motivated Los Angeles Lakers and the extremely hot Denver Nuggets. Now, the Magic did have a better record than the Denver Nuggets, as the Magic won 59 games throughout the regular season, while the Nuggets won only 54. But you have to consider that the Magic were playing a majority of their games against a weaker Eastern Conference, while the Nuggets were battling it out with a much tougher West. The other part you have to consider is how the Nuggets were building team chemistry throughout the season. Early during that season, the Nuggets traded Allen Iverson to the Detroit Pistons for the former Finals MVP Chauncey Billups. Although Iverson was certainly the bigger name, Billups was the better fit. The thing is, Denver had to build their chemistry throughout the season, but by the time the playoffs had rolled along, they were one of the hottest teams in the entire league. Kobe and Carmelo had epic individual battles throughout the West Finals, and at that point, everyone seemed to recognize that whoever won this series was going to win the NBA championship. Well, you guys know how this played out. Kobe and the Lakers won the series in 6 hard-fought games and advanced to the NBA Finals. And as expected, they made quick work of the vastly inferior Orlando Magic, comfortably winning in only 5 games. Lastly is the 2018 Western Conference Finals. For LeBron James fans, this season is remembered fondly for James's incredible effort throughout the regular season and the postseason, carrying his Cavs to the NBA Finals. Most people recognize how the Eastern Conference was weaker during this time, which aided LeBron's trip to the finals. Regardless, his incredible run was still impressive. One of the reasons LeBron's run was so improbable was the fact that this was his first season without Kyrie Irving by his side. When you look at that Cavs roster from top to bottom, anyone who knows basketball could see how they didn't have the same level of talent as the top 2 teams in the Western Conference. Those squads were the juggernaut Golden State Warriors and the 65-17 Houston Rockets. This is recent enough history that you guys probably know all of the details. Houston and Golden State had an epic 7-game series that looked like either team was capable of winning. Although the Warriors did end up closing out the series in the decisive 7th game, the Rockets' starting point guard and their second best player, Chris Paul, suffered a season-ending injury in the 5th game with the series tied at 2 games apiece. With Paul out of the lineup, the Rockets were incapable of reaching their ceiling, which ultimately led to the Warriors closing it out. The Warriors then went on to sweep LeBron James and the Cleveland Cavaliers in the NBA Finals. And in Game 1, it took one of the greatest performances of LeBron's life to even keep the game close. Not only do I believe the championship was decided in the West Finals, but the Rockets also won both of their regular season matchups against Cleveland that year by an average margin of 18 points. Whether it would have been the Rockets or the Warriors, I think either team would have made quick work of Cleveland in 2018. Throughout the decades, NBA brother duos have been making their impacts on the league. In some cases, one brother is vastly superior to the other, And in other cases, both players were just average NBA players at best. But in even rarer cases, both players were legitimate stars in the NBA. Today, I'm breaking down my list of the top 6 greatest brother duos in league history, and let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with my rankings. Number 6, Horace and Harvey Grant. I'm starting off my list with a pair of twins, as both of these brothers made their presence known as quality power forwards in the league. Let's first focus on Horace. He was definitely the more famous brother out of the two, as he's most known for being the third option during the Bulls' first three-peat in the 1990s. At his best, he was averaging about 15 points per game in Chicago, but his best quality, and too often an ignored aspect of his game, was his defense. Horace was a stifling presence in the post, as he made a total of 4 all-defense teams throughout his career, and was even an NBA All-Star in 1994. Add in his quality rebounding, and Horace obviously deserves more recognition for his championship contribution. Although Horace was more known, at his peak, you could argue that Harvey was the better scorer, as he averaged over 18 points per game over a 3-season stretch with the Washington Bullets. He was never the rebounder or defender that Horace was, and he never had a real shot at a championship due to playing for less competitive teams. But he knew how to get a bucket, and with their combined talent, they're good enough for the starting spot of the list. Number 5, Bernard and Albert King. Many people don't realize that the NBA Hall of Famer Bernard King actually had a brother who played in the league as well. Although there's no question that Bernard certainly had the better career, Albert was definitely a quality player in his own right. Bernard was the superstar though, as he made 4 All-Star teams and 4 All-NBA teams, which honestly should have been much more if knee injuries hadn't drastically shortened his basketball career. To this day, Bernard has the Christmas Day record when he dropped 60 points in 1984. Fun fact, he actually did that against his brother's team, the New Jersey Nets. Albert just didn't play on that specific night because of an injury. Bernard also led the NBA in scoring in 1985, when he averaged 32.9 points as a member of the New York Knicks. Now as for the younger brother Albert, he didn't have any records or any All-Star appearances, but at his peak, he certainly helped his team win basketball games. In the 82-83 season, Albert was the New Jersey Nets' leading scorer throughout the regular season, averaging 17 points, nearly 6 rebounds, and 4 assists on 47.5% shooting. His Nets won 49 games that year, earning a trip to the playoffs. To be clear, I definitely wouldn't classify both players as a superstar, but at one point, both players were simultaneously the best scorers for their franchises. Number 4, Steph and Seth Curry. Honestly, there's an argument here for these brothers to take the top spot, considering how Steph by himself is more accomplished than just about every other brother duo ahead of them. But the reason why I don't have them that high is because even though Steph is one of the greatest players of all time, Seth wasn't ever close to being considered as an elite player. With that being said, it's not like Seth isn't a quality basketball player, as he's established himself as one of the more efficient three-point shooters in the league, and as a solid scoring spark for the various teams he's played for. Seth doesn't have any accolades on his resume, but without question, he's worthy of a roster spot in the modern game. On the other hand, you don't need me to tell you much about Steph. He's a 2-time MVP, the only unanimous MVP in NBA history, a Finals MVP, the all-time leader in three-pointers made, and he has 4 championship rings. There's no question who carries the legacy in that family. Number 3, Dominique and Gerald Wilkins. For basketball historians, Dominique is a name that's fondly remembered, as he was one of the greatest dunkers that the game of basketball has ever seen. Beyond that, the human highlight film was just a great player overall, as he evolved into a fantastic three-point shooter in the second half of his career, and he was a dominant scorer throughout his entire playing days. Case in point, in his 15-year career, he had a scoring average nearly as high as Kobe Bryant's. Dominique was a 9-time All-Star. He made 7 All-NBA teams, he won the scoring title in 1986, and he's honored as one of the 75 greatest players in NBA history. The younger Gerald Wilkins has certainly lived in the shadow of his older brother, but this 6'6" shooting guard was a scoring force in his own right. He spent his prime years as a member of the New York Knicks, scoring as high as 19 points per game on 48% shooting in 1986. Not quite to the level of his brother, but Gerald was also a thunderous finisher at the rim, gifted with creativity and impressive leaping ability. Unfortunately, just like his brother, Gerald suffered a devastating Achilles injury late in his career. And although Dominique was able to bounce back to the level of his former self, Gerald was not. Ultimately, they're not in the number 1 spot on my list, but you'd be hard-pressed to find a pair of brothers who could score like these two could. Number 2, Tom and Dick Van Arsdale. Along with Horace and Harvey Grant, these legendary brothers are the only other twins on this list, and their connection as brothers is truly uncanny. Both players were 6'5" wings, and both players played for the University of Indiana. Both players were drafted in 1965 and with consecutive picks. Both players made the 66 All-Rookie team. Both players made 3 All-Star teams, and both players ended their careers as a member of the Phoenix Suns. The one advantage that Dick had was the fact that he made the NBA's All-Defensive team in 1974. Other than that, they were basically the same gifted all-around player. During his prime, these were the numbers that Dick put up over a 3-year stretch for the Phoenix Suns. And over that same period of time, these are the numbers that Tom put up as a member of the Cincinnati Royals. Genuinely, you could say that these two players were simultaneously among the best players in the game. And hilariously, whenever they were on the court as teammates, it would be difficult to stay with either of them defensively, considering the fact that they were basically impossible to tell apart outside of their jersey numbers. There's a lot more fascinating details about their story, so I'm sure these two will be getting their own video at some point, but in the meantime, they'll have to settle for second on my list. Here is my list of honorable mentions. Should any of these brothers have made the list instead? Feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Number 1, Pau and Marc Gasol. When it comes to both brothers each making their own tremendous impact in the league, there's really no competition for the top spot. Obviously, they'll always be connected as brothers, but many people forget that these two were once traded for one another, which was a part of the package that included Kwame Brown for Pau Gasol. At the time, it appeared to be one of the most lopsided trades that the league had ever seen. But considering how Marc developed into a star in Memphis, it truly wasn't all that bad after all. Pau was 7 feet tall, while Marc was 6'11". Both were incredibly talented and graceful big men, but Pau specialized in scoring, while Marc was the better defensive player. Let's start off by focusing on Pau. At his peak, he was averaging about 20 points per game and snagging nearly 10 rebounds. He was the 2002 Rookie of the Year. He made 6 All-Star teams and 4 All-NBA teams. Famously, he was the pivotal acquisition that took the Los Angeles Lakers from the usual first-round exit to a team that was continuously in the NBA Finals. As the second best player on the squad, Pau won back-to-back championships with the Lakers and had his legacy immortalized by having his jersey hung in the rafters. On the other hand, Marc made 3 All-Star teams and 2 All-NBA teams. He was the Defensive Player of the Year in 2013, and at his best, he was averaging nearly 20 points per game, while locking down the paint defensively for the Memphis Grizzlies. Later on, as the starting center for the Toronto Raptors, he won the NBA championship in 2019, securing the 3rd championship ring for the Gasol family. There have been many blockbuster trades throughout the game's history, but what would have been some of the craziest ones never panned out for one reason or another. Today, we're looking at some of the most insane trades that almost happened. Number 10, Klay Thompson to the Timberwolves. In 2014, the Warriors were seen as just short of being contenders, and Klay Thompson and Steph Curry were just on the verge of establishing themselves as superstars within the league. At this point, Kevin Love was already seen as a legit star for Minnesota, but the relationship between Love and the Wolves had grown cold. Negotiations were ongoing, but among the trade offers from Golden State included players like Draymond Green, Harrison Barnes, David Lee, and of course, Klay Thompson. Jerry West was a consultant for the Warriors at the time, and he threatened to resign from the Warriors staff if the team decided to trade Thompson. At the time, most Warriors fans would have desired Kevin Love over Thompson, but after West's ultimatum, the Warriors decided to hold on to their sharpshooting talent, and the rest is history. Number 9. Chris Paul to the Lakers. Of all the near trades on this list, this one was the closest to actually materializing, as for about a 45-minute window, it seemed as if it was a foregone conclusion. The Lakers would have given up both Pau Gasol and Lamar Odom, but the pairing of Paul and Bryant would have certainly made them contenders in the Western Conference. Los Angeles also had Andrew Bynum on the roster before he was inevitably traded for Dwight Howard 1 year later. Whether it was a trio involving Bynum or Howard, it would have been tough for Los Angeles to have got by the San Antonio Spurs or the Miami Heat, but they at least would have had a chance. Due to the recent resurgence of super teams, small market owners were furious at the Lakers' acquisition of Paul and demanded that the commissioner David Stern block the trade. Stern did just that, and later released a statement saying it was for, quote, basketball reasons. In the end, this is only now remembered as one of the most frustrating days of Lakers history. Number 8. Scottie Pippen to the Supersonics. If you've seen The Last Dance, then you'll remember Scottie Pippen having an icy relationship with the Bulls general manager, Jerry Krause. Due to this, Pippen was constantly among trade discussions, and one of the times he was in the summer of 1994. It was shortly after Michael Jordan's first retirement, and the Bulls management was considering a full rebuild. At the time, the player in consideration was the Seattle Supersonics dynamic power forward Shawn Kemp. Later on, Kemp would have made for an interesting running mate for Jordan in Chicago, while the tandem of Scottie Pippen and Gary Payton would have made for one of the greatest perimeter defenses that the game has ever seen. Fortunately for Chicago fans, the Bulls ultimately decided not to deal their star small forward as Pippen went on to win his 4th, 5th, and 6th championship with Chicago. Number 7. Kevin Garnett to the Lakers. Ultimately, the trade partner ended up being Boston, where KG went on to win his lone championship and the league's Defensive Player of the Year. But before that, one of the near destination landings for the big ticket was in Los Angeles. Garnett had always been vocal about his desire to play with Kobe Bryant, and it nearly happened as the Lakers were offering a trade package that included both Andrew Bynum and Lamar Odom. In this case, it was the Timberwolves who decided against it, as they held out for a better deal, which in their mind ended up being the Celtics offer in the summer of 2007. Would Garnett and Kobe have won championships together? With KG on the roster, it's unlikely that they ever make the Kwame Brown trade for Pau Gasol, so it's debatable whether or not that would have been a better thing for the Lakers in the long run, but at the very least, it makes for one intriguing what-if scenario. Number 6. Tracy McGrady to the 76ers. T-Mac's early years were famously spent with his fellow star, Vince Carter. The thing is, McGrady hadn't quite yet developed into the superstar that he would become in Orlando, so around the turn of the millennium, Toronto was prematurely evaluating their trade options. Before eventually settling on Orlando, McGrady was strongly being pursued by the Philadelphia 76ers. The main piece being offered was the shooting guard Larry Hughes. If the trade had materialized, it would have created a superstar tandem of Tracy McGrady and Allen Iverson, each as they were entering the prime of their careers. The two stars would have almost certainly dominated the Eastern Conference, considering how relatively weak the conference was in the early 2000s. Number 5. Charles Barkley to the Lakers. Turns out that a lot of the great what-if trades of basketball history involve the purple and gold, and in this case, it was for the all-time great power forward Charles Barkley. In 1992, the relationship between Barkley and the 76ers had soured, and although they eventually dealt Sir Charles to the Phoenix Suns, before that, he was nearly dealt to the Lakers. Reportedly, the package was Barkley and Ron Anderson for James Worthy and Eldon Campbell. It would have been just after Magic Johnson retired, but it also would have been just a few years before Shaq and Kobe were acquired. So it's no guarantee that the Lakers would have been contenders in the West. But at the very least, Charles was the league MVP the following season when he played in Phoenix, so he would have made them a viable threat until Shaquille O'Neal signed later on. Number 4. Steph Curry to the Milwaukee Bucks. In 2012, Steph Curry hadn't quite developed yet into the MVP superstar who would transform the league. In fact, he could barely stay on the court, as he was struggling through numerous ankle injuries. At the time, the Warriors were interested in acquiring the center Andrew Bogut from Milwaukee, and they did eventually get him in a trade, but one of the initial trade packages would have been involving Steph Curry. Obviously, a move like this would have had a tremendous effect on basketball history as we know it, as in this scenario, the Warriors franchise never becomes a dynasty. It's a large assumption to think that the Bucks would have simply drafted Giannis just a couple years later, when Curry almost certainly would have affected the draft position of the team. With that being said, considering how Milwaukee liked Giannis and picked him later in the first round, there's still a decent possibility that the tandem would have formulated. Number 3. Dirk Nowitzki and Steve Nash to the Raptors. Both were nearly traded together from the Dallas Mavericks to the Toronto Raptors. Both Dirk and Nash still had some things to prove as individual superstars, while Toronto's Vince Carter was at the height of his powers. The proposed trade was Dirk and Nash for Vince Carter and Antonio Davis. In hindsight, this is an obviously lopsided trade in favor of Toronto, but it didn't quite appear that way at the time, which is why Toronto's general manager was the one who ultimately declined the trade, opting to keep his superstar Vince Carter. Over the next several years, Dirk and Nash combined would each win numerous MVPs and an NBA championship, which left the Raptors organization feeling like they committed one of the more regrettable decisions of NBA history. Number 2. Kobe Bryant to the Chicago Bulls. In the summer of 2007, after back-to-back first-round exits to the Phoenix Suns, Kobe was extremely frustrated with the state of the Lakers, which is understandable since they had starters like Smush Parker, Luke Walton, and Kwame Brown. With a lack of a contender, which was promised to him when he signed a few years earlier, Kobe publicly demanded a trade elsewhere. Since Kobe had a no-trade clause, he gave the Lakers management a short list of teams that he was willing to go to, and among those teams was the Chicago Bulls. Reportedly, the Lakers and the Bulls had agreed to a deal, which would have sent Tyrese Thomas, Ben Gordon, Joakim Noah, and Luol Deng to Los Angeles for Kobe Bryant, but the Mamba ended up blocking the deal. The thing is, Kobe didn't want to go to a Chicago team that was devoid of talent, and in Kobe's own words, it would have been like going from one bad situation to another. Kobe said the only way he would approve a deal to Chicago is if Luol Deng was still there to play with him. Under these restrictions, the two teams were never able to make an agreement. Obviously, as a Lakers fan, I'm glad Kobe had a 20-year career with the Lakers, but it would have been at least interesting to see his career unfold in Chicago. He would have been playing in the shadow of the great Michael Jordan, and it would have been interesting to see if he could fill those shoes. It also would have put him in the same conference as LeBron James, where they would have inevitably had numerous battles in the NBA playoffs. Number 1. Michael Jordan and Clyde Drexler to the Houston Rockets. In my opinion, this is the greatest what-if trade of NBA history, and frankly, it's not even close. So let me first paint the picture. It's draft day 1984, and the Rockets have the first overall pick in the draft, followed by the Blazers with the second pick and the Bulls with the third pick. Obviously, in reality, we know how the draft went down. Hakeem Olajuwon was taken first by the Houston Rockets, Sam Bowie was taken second by the Blazers, which was a mistake to say the least, and Michael Jordan was taken third by Chicago. The thing is, there was a pre-selection trade in place which would have landed Michael Jordan, Hakeem Olajuwon, and Clyde Drexler all as teammates on the Houston Rockets. So essentially, the Rockets already had Hakeem Olajuwon and the Hall of Famer Ralph Sampson on the roster. Both were superstar big men who were each capable of playing the center position. Due to this, some saw Houston's Ralph Sampson as an expendable asset. Portland was interested in acquiring their own star big man in an era that was dominated by players at the center position. So an offer was in place that would have sent the second overall pick and Clyde Drexler to the Houston Rockets for Ralph Sampson. Hakeem Olajuwon talked about this proposed offer in his book called Living the Dream, and he said that if the deal had gone through, the Rockets would have taken Hakeem with the first pick, Michael Jordan with the second pick, and obviously they would have had Clyde Drexler as well. Theoretically, this would have formed the scariest big three on paper that the league has ever seen. Believe it or not, it was actually Houston who declined the offer and decided to stick with their twin tower tandem of Hakeem and Sampson. It's not like Houston ended up being total failures for declining this offer, considering how they still went on to win multiple championships with Hakeem. But hypothetically, if they had Hakeem, Jordan, and Drexler all since 1984, how many championships could they have won? 8? 10? 12? Let me know your estimation. So now it's your turn. What is one of the crazier what-if trades that never panned out? I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments section below. Thanks for watching as always. Make sure to like and subscribe for more basketball content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.